I call the Planning Commission meeting dated Tuesday, March 13th to order. And could we please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Can we have a roll call, please?
Yes. Commissioner DeMond?
Here.
Commissioner Benjamin?
Here.
Commissioner Evans?
Here.
Commissioner Holt is absent this evening, and Commissioner Hernandez is on his way, so he's not present at the moment.
All right. So the next item is the approval of the minutes, and I think we have a kind of a logic problem since it takes 3 people to approve these, and I think for several of them I have to abstain because I wasn't at the meeting and others have to, so I think we can only do the meeting minutes dated February 27th. Am I correct on that?
Yes, that's correct.
Through the chair. So I had one correction to those minutes, or clarification perhaps, which was with respect to the property on at the corner of Highway 1 and Poplar. There was a reference to noise in the Planning Commission discussion section, and I just wanted to clarify that the concern I raised, what it says is acknowledges potential noise impact, and that's true, but to just put a sharper point on it, my concern was I know that they can deal with the noise inside through soundproofing. It's the noise in the outside garden areas of the property that I wanted to see if there was a way to address, if it could be designed so that they would have more livable exterior spaces that weren't impacted by noise. With that, I move that we approve the minutes for the Planning Commission meeting of February 27th, 2018.
I have a question for the staff.
Well, we need a second, or motion on the table? Or?
Yeah, the chair. Okay.
So I'm finding that in the summary of the discussion items, I would prefer it's either more generalized or more specific. Because in just taking the first project, there's quite a few inaccurate statements, and there's not real clarity to which commissioners and which people these discussions were coming from. And so I'm wondering if, and I probably right now is not the time to have any lengthy debate about this, but I just find that it could be much more generalized and refer to the public record or the recordings, or be much more specific, which is probably too laborious for the minutes. Because in the form, there's too many corrections. I'd prefer not to approve them.
All right, so I'm going to suggest that we take those back to the shop, and we'll simplify them. For planning commission meetings where we have an action, we almost take action minutes. We really simplify and focus on the motion and any amendments to any recommendations. With study sessions and the meetings where we've been talking about the general plan, we've been trying to capture more of the information, and because we're not at a decision-making process at that point, but getting your feedback about these is helpful. I actually tried to group them by topic, because when you were going one after another, it was spreading out the subject areas, so you'll notice things that you said may be grouped with another commissioner's comments. We don't intend to specify each commissioner's comments in a study session unless it's something that is really specifically unique or outspoken or something. So that was what our intent was. We will take these back, we'll bring them back to you, but now that we have 4 commissioners present, I think we could take the December 12th minutes. Because oh no, never mind.
No, I think the only one. So
the only one, yep. Okay.
Is there a second on the February 27th?
Never mind, okay.
A second?
Yep.
No, she said they're gonna,
Yeah, but we can vote on the 27th, right?
You
February 27th.
can, you can.
So-
You don't have a second. We should have taken a second before we took
Okay,
a
so
question.
is
Yep.
there a second for the 27th of February minutes?
I wasn't here, so I can't second.
So you can't approve the
The chair,
minutes?
through the chair could second it if the
Okay,
wishes.
I will second, and I will call for a vote for the February 27th. All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No,
Okay. Okay. All right. So,
Got the input about the form of
oh,
the
thank you.
minutes. Okay, thank you.
let the record show that Chair Hernandez has arrived and that I am passing the gavel to the chair.
Thank you so much, Les. Appreciate that. Okay, do we have any other minutes to approve?
We can't.
Okay.
You have two other sets, but Vice Chair Holt was at both of those meetings, and we need him present to have a quorum of you to approve them.
So at this point, I will close the approval of the minutes and move to public comment. For those of you in the very wide representation we have today who would like to make a comment for something not on the agenda, the microphone is open. You're welcome to step up. We'd like it if you filled out a green form. Seeing nobody jumping to the mic, I will close public comment and move on to the Planning Commission business/study session.
Right. So the first item tonight we would normally convey to you as a consent calendar item, which is the annual housing element report that we submit to HCD, the State Department of Housing and Community Development. I agendized it so we could just talk about it for just a few minutes because I think it provides context for your other items and a lot of other conversation that's actually going on in your community at in city council forums and elsewhere about affordable housing. So as you saw in the annual report, we produced 15 units with certificates of occupancy in 2017. 3 of those 15 were accessory dwelling units. The prior year, we had a few more units overall. I think it was 18, 3 of which that in 2016 were also accessory dwelling units. We've been doing about 3 ADUs a year for a few years, although we're picking up the pace now, and we'll jump into that in our study session in a minute. As you'll note, the very low and low income category housing that really doesn't come in with private development other than a few BMR units that you might see with subdivisions. We have a BMR ordinance, the below market rate, and for subdivisions of 10 or more, we have a 20% requirement. There were 2 subdivisions that required that this year, but you're not going to see the units for a while. But I did want you to know about that. Typically, though, getting those very low and low are going to come through development by an affordable housing developer who is able to cobble together tax credits and other funding sources. And we are in our housing element, we have a program to continue to maintain relationships with affordable housing developers. And these projects take time, and so you can hit your RENA number kind of in a bright spot for the year or two when you might have a project like that, but other years those categories are not looking good. So we want you to know that we do maintain those relationships. I go to Housing Leadership Day every year. I participate in Home for All along with your mayor, which is frequently meeting, and there's quite a few developers there. And I attend quarterly 21 Elements meetings, which is all about housing elements in San Mateo County. And we also are working with the planning directors who have a number of affordable housing developers come to those sessions. So we know many of them, we work with them, they're looking at sites, these things take time. And when we can daylight anything, we will do that. But I know it was concerning, and it, of course, concerns me. The good thing about your element is you have an 8-year cycle, and that's very helpful. Previously, housing elements were on 5-year cycles, and so this gives us a little more time to work through that. If you have questions about the housing element report.
Yeah, I just, so this is probably, there's one that's retrospective, and one that's prospective. We had, when we opened the senior center, I'm imagining that qualified as below market rate. And there were probably a lot more units there than we were actually required to produce under RENA. And I wonder if we carry forward at all, or if that just becomes the denominator for an even bigger number in some future year. That's the retrospective question.
So those units were counted in the previous housing element cycle, so we don't get to include them in this 8-year cycle. They
They're
were
gone.
counted in the previous, and they weren't more than we needed.
Oh.
They fulfilled what we needed to do. If you do get more low, very low, for example, then that category requires, then you can count the additional very low as low, or you can count the more affordable units into the higher affordability level.
But can you carry forward
No.
from one period to the next?
No, only in the cycle time.
Okay. And then the prospective question, occasionally we see projects for homes that are being developed privately without the involvement of MidPen or some of the other agencies that specialize in affordable housing. And these homes might be on much smaller lots, be a little bit untraditional, probably be less expensive than some of their larger peers. I'm assuming that when that comes along, even though it's not being sold with restrictions, the fact that it is sold below the median average selling price, if it is in fact, then it would count in these categories regardless of whether MidPen or other housing agency specialists are involved. Is that true?
The answer is it depends. So for single family, even the little tiny houses like what we saw in the last study session, we're aware of small narrow lot houses selling for upwards of $900,000. They don't come close to qualifying for being
okay.
affordable to very low or even moderate income. That said, accessory dwelling units, which are much smaller and they're on the same property, and we're obviously our subject in a moment here, they tend to rent out at a much lower rate. Rental is going to be much more likely to qualify at those lower affordability levels than ownership housing. It's really hard to get ownership housing to fit into any of those categories unless it's a Habitat for Humanity project. It's almost impossible.
Thank you. That was a very prescient answer you had.
Okay.
You answered my third question.
All right, so I do want to say HCD is letting us count ADUs in the moderate income category right now. I hope we can do a rent study at some point in the future. If they're coming in at lower levels, lower rental rates, we may be able to put them into the low category. So we'll take a look at that.
Yeah, so Jill, just to kind of define this, this is not the annual report of our Measure D, right? So this comes separate, and so this is just looking at low, moderate income, am I correct?
This is, yeah,
Even
they're
though
different.
we don't have a official program for ADUs, accessory dwelling units, you mentioned here that you're just using certificates of occupancy as a count over here. So that's something in the future, or maybe as we talk about this, we're going to have to kind of integrate. Am I correct in that assumption?
There's a lot of minutia in how we do our housing element report, and there's uniquenesses to each city. In Half Moon Bay, HCD has agreed with the city to use the certificate of occupancy as the measure of when you count the units. Most cities count the units when they have a planning entitlement. It takes a while here to get things done, built, and finalized. And HCD was noticing that, staff was noticing that. We felt that it was the most honest approach to actually count the unit when it could be occupied. So we've been doing that for, since before me. I think it started about 2014 or 15. I confirmed it with them last year, and they're comfortable with us continuing. So that's something that is part of our system of counting with them. It's different than how we issue Measure D certificates. Measure D certificates are purchased basically, and by somebody who wants to develop a unit, and they're kept alive by keeping an entitlement process active. And so they're issued before anything's possibly even approved by you, or a building permit is issued, or anybody's living in the unit. It's at the front end of the process. Okay, I know that's a lot of
Thank you.
gunk. Yeah. Okay.
John, do you have anything? So I'm going to get this wrong, so
All right.
as I usually do. But the sentiment, I hope, will be understood. We're in year 4 of an 8-year planning cycle. And was the previous planning cycle also an 8-year cycle? And so we had at least 138 affordable units produced. If I look at Leslie Gardens, during that previous 8-year cycle, I assume there may be a couple of other units, but directionally, we needed, what I heard, to produce 140 affordable housing units to comply with the state standards.
The previous RENA for Half Moon Bay was higher than what we have now. This period, we have 240 units, and about half of those are in a controlled area of the affordability, the low, very low, and mod. The previous, I can't remember what the number was for the cycle 4, but it was more than 240. It was almost 300 units.
Okay.
Yeah.
But directionally, we need a plan for 240 affordable housing units during the next 5 years, and 140 low to very low.
Right, right. So what we want to, and I can't believe I didn't bring it. Your plan is your housing element with its policies and programs. So what we're hoping to do tonight with the ADU, this is actually implementing a program in the housing element as that moves forward. And I know that you had other questions about it, and so feel free to continue.
No, where I was going was, from a planning perspective, we have an obligation to put in place policies that help support, call it 240 affordable housing units. Does the city have an obligation to have a clear-cut plan to get to the 240 affordable housing units? And my recommendation would be maybe having a very simple message to city council and just saying, hey, we have an obligation, we need a plan, because if we don't have a plan, we're not going to get there in the next 5 years. That would be my concern, is we need to have some kind of plan to get to 240 affordable housing units.
And I just want to make sure that I didn't say this wrong. It's 240 units total. About half of them can be market rate. So it's not quite as onerous, but yes.
Whatever the number is.
So
we need a
this
plan.
is, I understand. This report will go to City Council at their meeting next week. We try to bring it through both the Planning Commission and Council before its due date, which is April 1st. And I'm intending to agendize it for them as well and not have it as a consent item, and I've actually already written their staff report. Anticipating that I may need to edit it after this meeting. So this is very helpful, and we'll discuss it there, I'm sure.
Thanks, Jill. I'm going to turn it over to Jimmy. And
So just one more, I'll probably get it wrong too now. So apparently my misunderstanding was that our goal was to make sure we had designed policies that would, make it possible, that we wouldn't have policies that would be burdensome, but that we actually do not have, we're not going to stand, HCD is not going to stand in judgment and say 120 units are not there, we are going to stop you from getting grants or some other ruinous activity if we've made the effort. We cannot, unless we become the developers, we cannot accept responsibility for actually achieving these rates. Is that wrong?
It's not our parents' HCD anymore. They're putting a lot more teeth into housing law, and so they're expecting production. We need to show significant effort towards it. And going back to the plan, remembering what the housing element contains, first is an adequacy of sites. Do we have enough places that these units could be located, including enough sites that provide for enough density so that affordable units could be located there? Your sites analysis from the 2015 housing element did not even use it didn't use any of the PUDs in the city. And adequate sites were found with infill sites. That said, some of the sites, so we're not going to pick on this, but Creekside, for example, which went through quite a gauntlet with the Coastal Commission, was cited to hold 19 units, but the developer ended up having their project reduced by the Coastal Commission, and right now they really only have 16 units. So we're going to have to demonstrate that we have enough sites for another 3 units or encourage this developer to get a density bonus. So there's a lot at play in the different pressures from the coastal program and the housing element.
Okay, so
That
I'll be
help?
happy to learn more. Thank you.
It's, me too. Okay.
All right, great. So I'm not seeing any more questions or comments from my colleagues. Yes, can we get a motion?
Oh. That's helpful.
For the record, Tim Pond is getting his car.
Okay. I move that we confirm the receipt of the housing element annual report.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay, moving right along. Item number 2.
All right. So the item before you tonight, a study session on accessory dwelling units, has really been, there's a number of pressures that brought it forward, and changing conditions, and really a positive level of interest in this topic. Recent state laws changed. We talked about that over a year ago, and the coastal zone has quite a few exceptions out of those state laws. That said, the Coastal Commission has now, as you saw in your packet, provided 2 guidance documents on ADUs, and they really came quite a long way between their April 2017 and their November 2017 guidance document. And that was helpful to us. It was also been helpful to observe what San Mateo County has done in the unincorporated mid-coast, where they first updated their ADU ordinance for all the unincorporated areas outside the coastal zone, and then they were able to bring those updates into the coastal zone and get them approved by the Coastal Commission. And we'll talk about some of the different components of what they did. We're not totally digging into theirs. We're kind of thinking about how our ordinance has worked and ways that we think it could be improved. There's been a couple projects recently that we think updates to our ordinance would have benefited and could possibly still benefit. And so we can note those as well. So I'm joined by Sarah Clark today. Sarah is our deputy city attorney. She works with Heather, who is usually here, our assistant city attorney. Sarah has provided a significant amount of guidance on this and a lot of writing and research, and we had fun. And she's done a lot of ordinance work on both accessory dwelling units as well as short-term rentals. So that's why she's going to hang out with us tonight and help with some of those technical questions. So with regards to state law, you saw in your staff report a number of of things that have been put forth and the intention of that state law. And, 2 weeks ago, Peggy Jensen, our deputy county manager from San Mateo County, gave a very beautiful presentation about accessory dwelling units and really taught us a lot about the context in the county as a whole. This is not that presentation. We are focused on land use primarily and how to facilitate accessory dwelling units within the intent of state law, which is to get more produced and to acknowledge that the way the state is working with them, that they are accessory uses to the single family use, which is a different way of thinking about it than thinking of it as, say, like a duplex. The process that is strongly encouraged is ministerial, insofar as any application for an accessory dwelling unit conforms to the basic code. Second best is administrative, which is something that we have to consider in the coastal zone under certain circumstances, and we can talk about when and why we might do that, although staff is eager to discuss potential exemptions with the commission and to hear from the community about that so that we can work with Coastal Commission staff on what might be appropriate for that. Also, the state law was really helpful in terms of defining 3 different types of ADUs. Wholly within is an ADU that would be contained within existing single-family home without having to do an addition. It would require a tenant improvement. Maybe you move walls, you have to put in a kitchen, add an exterior entrance so it has its own separate access point. But it is considered wholly within, which is not development from the perspective of state law and, frankly, of the Coastal Commission. New development ADUs could be additions to a single-family home, or they could be a detached ADU. And there's different kind of nuances about each of those situations. They also have a thing called junior ADUs. We are not required to take those on. No city is, and we found them to be quite redundant to the wholly within, and actually having looked at all the ADU applications and inquiries that we've had over the last couple of years, nobody really qualified for one or wanted one. Anything that was close to it would have been qualified as a wholly within. So we were focused in that area, and that's why. So what's required is really expediting the review, addressing parking requirements. I think it was a half mile from a transit stop is caused to not require the additional parking space. In most cities in the past, a single family home is supposed to have 2 covered parking spaces, and then if you had an ADU, you'd need a 3rd. Some cities would tolerate it being in tandem, which means it was in the driveway, or it could be in a setback area, such as a front or a side yard. Other cities were very, very strict that it had to be independently accessible, which is really hard to fit on a typical, 5,000 to 7,500 square foot residential lot. I worked for a city that had that strict requirement, and it was quite a trick. No size limit for wholly within existing construction. That's a state law requirement. So you could have a 3,000 square foot house, and if they wanted to make the ADU half of the house size, that's a big ADU, but that would be something that we need to make sure we allow in our code. And we're not allowed to require new utility connections. Now that's really important because ADUs are considered to be an extension of the single-family home. So insofar as you might have an addition to a house that's as big as the ADU, you wouldn't need another water connection. You wouldn't need to do anything with your sewer connection, and we're supposed to treat ADUs the same way. And frankly, we have been. Nothing has been coming up with the sewer side of it. The water district does like to require a second water meter, but that's not a connection. That's just measuring how much water is going to the ADU separately. It's a piggybacked meter from the meter to the house. That said, we're going to meet with them because there are many situations where the homeowner doesn't need that water bill separated out, and they're perfectly fine providing water to both the main dwelling as well as the ADU, and water meters are not cheap, so we're going to look at that. State law also allows for discretion, and there's more things they require, more things that are allowed for discretion, and Sarah will bail me out if we don't cover them all, but I focused on the ones that I thought you'd be the most interested in. In particular, you have discretion about where they can be located, which zoning districts, and we'll jump into that in a little bit. However, the intent from state law is that they would be allowed on virtually any lot where there's a legally developed single-family home. That's really what they want. You have discretion provided that development standards are objective. So for how big, the setbacks, how high, what's the floor area ratio, does the siding, trim, and roofing match the siding, trim, and roofing of the rest of the property, but not something like, oh, does it look like the neighborhood or something like it? Something, yes, you have a question?
The purpose of that is you're trying to make this ministerial. You're not trying to have somebody apply discretion. It needs to be as clear-cut as possible. Okay.
Okay. So want to just note a few of the points from the Coastal Commission's guidance. They support the intention of state law. That became more clear in the second guidance document. They're very clear that in no way does that mean we would ignore our mandates to protect coastal resources, visual resources, and coastal access pursuant to the coastal zone. They also note that local control is really important, and they did not dictate how coastal cities do this and how they implement the state law, and understanding that each city is quite different in character and has their own ordinances that have been working for them, or perhaps not, and should be in control of putting that together, of moving towards what the intent of the state law is. They also note that wholly within really they're not development. They don't require CDP. Detached structures, the exempt status is unsure from what I've kind of looked through in their guidance, looking at how San Mateo County has done it, needing to work with Coastal Commission staff a little bit on this. Right now we would exempt an addition to a single-family home if it was less than 10% of the floor area of the existing structure. That in most cases isn't going to get you an ADU. So that exemption probably wouldn't cover very many of these. It might cover a few. So I'm really interested in your feedback about exemptions for the case of properties that are not in a visual resource area, not affecting coastal access, and nowhere near a water course or any other kind of coastal resource, but it's in the middle of an existing neighborhood, and whether or not that new detached 650 square foot ADU could be exempt from a CDP. I'd like it to be, but I think we can do a great job with that, but I know that's uncomfortable. That isn't how we've been practicing. What we would do with that one right now, and this is from our 2015 update to the ADU code, is we have what we've deemed an administrative coastal development permit, which really is a coastal development permit that we're processing in an administrative manner. But because it's a coastal development permit, We still have to notice it, so we send an ad over to the newspaper, and that's $100 or so to the applicant. We notice the neighbors, and we put a sign in their yard. And then we put a date on when the decision will be made, and we're talking about units that conform to all of our standards. So that process was negotiated between the city and the Coastal Commission, and they wanted to maintain that the last time we updated our ordinance. What county's looking at doing is having a process like that if the property is in the Coastal Commission appeals jurisdiction. And of course, if we had any resources, but we are all trying to figure out how to do exemptions and waivers, which, by the way, is part of the Coastal Commission's guidance. They are encouraging waiver processes, although we don't have any exclusion areas, so we can't do waivers. Okay, so back to where you have discretion. Our study session is going to focus on some of those key topics of where can they go, and we'll talk about zoning districts, and size, we'll discuss that, and occupancy requirements, that should hopefully be an easy one. Parking, want to talk about that. Measure D, this was our best time, was Measure D research. Yeah, we bonded. Okay, it was great. So, and I think that's about it. So let's go back to where do they go. Currently, the city's code, which is actually called second units, and so we are encouraged to update our language for that, specifies the R1, 2, and 3 zoning districts, as well as our mixed-use zoning districts, which tend to be in and around the downtown core area. We do not specify any of the other zones where we have single-family development occurring legally, and in particular the planned unit developments. We note about the PUDs that the big one, of course, is Ocean Colony, but we also have Pacific Ridge coming online, for example, where we have single-family development. They may have CCNRs that are not allowing for accessory dwelling units. The city does not enforce CCNRs, but if they have CCNRs that don't allow them, then if we were to add PUDs, it really wouldn't affect them at this point in time. That said, we have a sense of why don't you introduce this wonderful topic?
Sure. So I just wanted to mention sort of where the state is going with ADUs. We've seen successive ADU pieces of legislation coming out of the state in 2014, 2016, and 2017. There are 4 current bills that are being debated on the floor of the state legislature. The trend, as you are aware, is to take away discretion from local jurisdictions and to really look at the hindrances to development of ADUs and try and go at those. This is just pure prognostication, but I know that HCD is concerned about CCNRs and other covenants that restrict ADU development, and so I would not be surprised if that is something that the state legislature tries to deal with in upcoming sessions. I don't have any inside information that that's what they're looking at, but just based on what HCD has said, I would not be surprised if that's something that changes in the near future.
So just to put it as a simple example,
Sure.
if you live in Ocean Colony and there are restrictions on what you do today,
Yes.
The city may say an accessory dwelling unit's allowed, but that would be prohibited.
Mm-hmm.
But if, hypothetically speaking, Alan Alifano decides he wants to build an accessory dwelling unit and the law changes, the state may say you can't enforce the CCNR to block an ADU.
That's correct.
Okay.
And I need to be clear, I don't know if we have HOAs that are disallowing them at this point, although it seems like it because we're not seeing ADUs in some of these areas. I would expect where we have the really larger homes, such as those that are coming in at Pacific Ridge, that they're really only going to be able to accommodate the wholly within style of an ADU because they've already maxed out their floor area ratio. They've already really built out the lot. There are non-conforming conditions of single-family homes on smaller urban reserve and open space reserve parcels. I've been asked many, many times if ADUs could be developed on those lots, and we've done legal review of that. And the way our code is written now, it's not allowed. So we're just, you know, the intent of having non-conforming regulations is to phase out non-conforming development. In this case where we have these small parcels, and we've talked about this as part of the LCP update land use discussions, is it really going to eventually change what's on some of these sites? And staff's belief is probably not for a very, very long time. And would an ADU added to the site overdevelop it? We doubt it. Most of these lots are much bigger than the single-family home lots in our established neighborhoods. So we just pitched it out to see what you think. Our ADU code also is very specific, and the point of it is that these units are added to single-family home lots. And a really interesting prospect came up where we have a developer who wants to do duplexes in one of our subdivisions and is wondering how to invoke the density bonus ordinance, because in the R2 zoning district, the most you can do is a duplex on a lot. And the way to possibly have a bonus unit would be to allow an ADU with a duplex or a triplex. It's kind of a one-off, but we would like to be able to accommodate density bonus provisions in any of the zoning districts where it's applicable. So we just brought that forward because this is something that we could do as a cleanup kind of item if you're interested. We don't have to address it. This is outside the bounds of what state law is looking at. It's more, it's from staff. This is a practice item that we're curious about.
Jill, can you comment on, I mean, you've indicated that you've had somebody request an accessory dwelling unit for a duplex, and folks who have urban reserve or open space reserve have talked to you about ADUs, but what about PUDs? I mean, to me, you've got two categories of PUDs, ones that are, I dare say, wholly undeveloped, and ones that have some sporadic development on them. Can you clarify what you're looking for from the PUD's perspective?
I'm only thinking about PUDs that have lots, legal lots that are developed with existing single-family homes. So I'm not, this wouldn't apply to anything that doesn't have a single-family home on it yet. Specifically, Ocean Colony in particular, as well as the Pacific Ridge coming online, would be of interest. Most of the other residential PUDs we have are some kind of multifamily product, attached products and other kinds of condos, so they would not qualify for an ADU, like Cypress Cove. We're not talking about that for ADUs.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's location. How big should it be? So right now, the city's code caps the ADU at 700 square feet. What Sarah has found in her research is that HCD is pretty comfortable with 800 square feet and starts to be a little unhappy if the city has a smaller maximum size. So we're close to that now. What San Mateo County did is put a 750 square foot max, and then they have a another scaling method where it's 35% of the existing development for a detached ADU, or the 750 square feet, whichever is larger. And if it's wholly within, they're putting at 50%. I'm not sure how they're doing that because our take is that we really don't have discretion over the wholly within. The 800 square feet, it could just as easily be 750. I kind of like the county scaling method. What I can tell you is it's hard to fit a 700 square foot ADU on most Half Moon Bay parcels. So bumping it up a little bit is probably not going to make a huge wow of a difference, although it might make a few ADUs a little bit more comfortable. We've had a couple that are like 730 square feet, and it's really frustrating to have to modify them. But 700 square feet is pretty good. The other thing that we're uncomfortable with is allowing them to be really big. The state law is up to 1,200 square feet in some circumstances. And that seems contrary to the intent of affordable by design, which is what these are supposed to be. So anyway, our practice of just processing them and seeing how hard it is to shoehorn them in anyway, we think a modest bump up to the satisfaction, we hope, of HCD and of our community members would be an appropriate way to do it. And I could imagine just making it very simple and raising the limit straight across, or some kind of a scaling method. And I do like what San Mateo County did, although we wouldn't suggest doing that for the wholly within. We'd only look at it for the detached. So quickly on occupancy, this is what we do now, and this is what we think is important to continue to do, and we are allowed to do this. Every single family lot where an ADU is developed is required to have a deed restriction put in place so that either the home or the unit must be owner occupied. It's not a great thing to have to enforce, but that said, it is a permanent sort of acknowledgement of the purpose of the ADU to be used for housing and to maintain the presence of homeowner and not to turn it into a fully rental property. So this is really common. This is not a surprising piece of our code. Maybe folks have other opinions about it that I really don't know about, but I've seen this in almost every city I've looked at. So we didn't think it was an issue, but we wanted to bring it up. Moving on to parking. Now parking is, so this is an area where the city's parking code actually it gets confused with our second unit ordinance code around parking requirements, because the two code sections have different requirements and processes for dealing with exceptions. So first and foremost, if we come back to you with an ordinance, we'd like the accessory dwelling unit ordinance to have its own parking requirements contained entirely within that code section and not bouncing out to our parking code where, you know, a parking exception in the downtown area, in some areas, only the Planning Commission can approve that. And it's a very strange thing to have to do for an ADU, and that conflicts with our ADU code. So we just want it, whatever the code's going to be, we want it to live with the ADUs and keep it really along the lines of what the state wants, make it clear and easy to implement. Right now, Half Moon Bay allows tandem parking. I don't think we specify the limit of how many cars we can have in a row. State law wants us to allow tandem parking, parking in the side yard setback, parking in the front yard setback, and I think we already do that. San Mateo County put a cap on tandem of 3 cars. I think that was probably reasonable, so 3 in a row down a long driveway. That's the concept there. The state law bit, though, that we haven't addressed in our code anywhere that is relatively new is that the a requirement for the additional parking space for an ADU would be not applicable to sites that are within 1/2 mile of a transit station. And so this is interesting here because we're counting bus stops. We're not, we don't have the kind of transit that they probably envisioned, or the frequency, the headways, the amount of ridership, et cetera. But state law tells us that we can't really kind of specify the headway thing. So what we were looking at, and I put it on the zoning map behind me, is that if you were to take that straight up, and I didn't measure off the transit stops, I just measured off Highway 1. I didn't have time to find them all. We have maps of them, but that would cover almost every single residential neighborhood in Half Moon Bay, with exceptions of the western edge of Ocean Colony and a little tip of Alsace-Lorraine and the eastern side of Pacific Ridge. Everything else would fall within a 1/2 mile of Highway 1. Now, if that's what you want to do, that's straightforward, and we can just put it, you probably just want to exempt it for everything, but that's a concern. I don't know if that's where you want to go. Now, another option, we don't have to exactly follow this state law if we have an objective alternate approach. And one alternate approach would be to exempt the parking requirement, for example, in the downtown core area, because it's more of a mixed-use environment where reduced parking is probably an easier thing to deal with, or not. So anyway, those are just a couple ideas about the parking and what state law is looking at doing. And it's a little unusual when it's applied to Half Moon Bay, because your transit condition is different, I think, than, yeah. Okay. Yes, please.
I wanted to add one additional piece of information and a clarification on the state law issue. So the first additional piece of information is that the San Mateo County Code does do this 1/2 mile transit stop exemption. And so similarly, along Highway 1, most of the ADUs that are developed in that corridor will be exempt. On the question of whether and how the city might go a different route than what state law intends, that would need to be grounded in the Coastal Act. And so in all other cities that are not within the coastal zone, they don't have a choice as to whether to exempt themselves from this ordinance. This is just the law now. And the state legislature back in 2016 was very clear that they were concerned about parking restrictions for ADUs, that they saw that as a very large impediment to their development. And so that's why we got these exemptions in the first place. And so just to be clear, if we do seek your feedback on this issue, but it is going to be a question that the city needs to consider as to how we would address and tie any deviation from state law to our requirements under the Coastal Act. Just want to make that clarification.
Oh, good. Here we are. Okay. So this has come up with our LCP update discussions last fall about accessory dwelling units and infill development that we were looking into. And so we dug in because whether or not a Measure D certificate needs to be issued for an ADU has been a question of a little bit of debate, and there's good reason for that. There's quite a bit of inconsistency in what we're relying on for implementing this. And here's what we found, and then we'll tell you where we would suggest landing, and we think it's pretty consistent with your discussion from a few months ago. So the Measure D ballot measure, the actual language that folks saw when they went and voted, did not exempt ADUs. The residential dwelling unit allocation system in 1706 of the city's Muni Code, which is actually, that's our subdivision ordinance, exempts ADUs along with density bonus units and replacement one-for-one units. So it's one of 3 exemptions that are listed.
Sorry,
Yep.
Jill, is that for the city or the county?
Ours, this is us, yep. And then again, us, residential growth limitation in the zoning code, 1804, does not exempt ADUs. It exempts the one-for-one replacement and the density bonus units, but not ADUs. And then the second dwelling unit code itself, 1833, is silent on the topic, so there's no help there. But what we did learn is San Mateo County has been counting them, and they will continue to count them as they are part of their 1% growth limit after their LCP update. They may have even been counting them before that. They don't have Measure D, so they don't have this certificate process. They have an they're counting what they do, like we do with this HCD report. So what we would suggest, and we need to look into this a bit more, but we think we should be issuing Measure D certificates for them. At a minimum, we should be counting them. Now, I don't want everybody to think this is a shameful, crazy, bad thing that we haven't been doing. It's been 3 a year. This is not, we can deal with this. My concern is the intent of state law and how much a Measure D certificate costs and what it's supposed to represent. It's supposed to represent it could represent a big house. These are not big houses. And the certificate is, $700 or $800, and it's another impediment to developing them. So we would have to have City Council approve some kind of a fee reduction. Staff would advocate for not charging for Measure D certificates for ADUs, depending on the Planning Commission and public input. In that the county doesn't have to issue these certificates and simply counts them. We think that would be consistent with what they're doing and seems like a fair thing. The other concern, though, is because of the limit in how many certificates we can issue in a year. For example, this year is 66. We haven't run out for I don't know if we've ever used all of our, maybe we have many years ago.
2006.
2006? Okay, so quite a while back. Last few years, we've been issuing less than half of the certificates. Probably, let's see, last year was like 25 out of 66. So there is this competition and way to gain points for your development to be prioritized for certificates. One of the benefits is a single-family home that would come in with an ADU. We would like the ADU to be considered as receiving those points so that it could compete fairly against other units, and to think about that a little bit. So that's Measure D. Those are very early suggestions on how we would see implementing it at this point, absent your input, absent the community's input. But we thought it would be helpful to have a place to start and some background on that. And I don't know what happened there. Okay, so that is it for this. We've really focused on land use. There are a lot of other components to processing that we can discuss. I think you got the gist that staff is supportive of working our way towards state law. If we have an ADU that conforms to everything that we have, we really see this as something that we should be able to do as close to ministerially as possible. We have obviously some time for clarifying questions from the Planning Commission. I saw a stack of comment cards coming your way, and look forward to your discussion.
I'd like to open up for clarifying questions. Jimmy?
So this was a great report. Thank you for providing it, and good questions. So I had a lot of comments on it, but I'll wait because I'm interested in what the public has to say. Clarifying questions, though. Here we are focused on, the accessory dwelling ordinance, and I just want to understand whether staff feels that there is a nexus between our decision-making here and the analysis that we do of the consumption of resources as we revise our local coastal program. I understand from this text that we're not, for example, that we're not supposed to, if we're to conform with this law, we wouldn't want to require an additional connection to water. We wouldn't require an additional SAM. We wouldn't require additional taxes for schools, probably, although that hasn't come up. And yet, ADUs will create additional families that will make use of those public resources. So it's independently of whether we head towards state law or we make ask for variations from it, the ramifications of the decisions we make here would seem to have implications for the public facilities section of our local coastal program in terms of what would constitute a reliable water supply, adequate sewer treatment capacity. What do we anticipate as the level of service or whatever the service standards we use for our roads? Is that staff's position that we would take this information and modify previous assumptions on which we've gone to the bank in terms of will serve letters coming from other agencies and our assessment of reliable water supply and all that sort of thing? Tough question, maybe.
That's a big question. I'm not going to be able to answer all of it. I think I can share a few thoughts on some of it. With regards to sewer capacity and water supply, neither of those really should be impacted from this particular approach, because you could have a very large addition to a single-family home and a lot more people living in it and have the exact same way of accounting for it. And we think it's equivalent. The state thinks it's equivalent. The county, or the Coastside, County Coastside Water District is not lacking for water. And an ADU is not going to be the thing that really tips it over the top in terms of water demand. It's a reasonable amount of water demand. It's water connections that are the issue. It's sort of the artificial constraint of how many water connections have been issued. So I would hope that would not be the concern on water and sewer. Traffic's interesting because the city does charge traffic impact fees for new single-family development or any residential development. They are impact fees that are intended to address the cumulative impacts of development in the long term. So nexus studies are done, projects are identified that need to be put in place to accommodate growth in the future, and those impact fees are supposed to pay to implement those projects. ADUs are typically not required to pay traffic impact fees. They do pay to the school fee. That's part of the building permit, and it has to do with how many square feet are built. If it's wholly within, it probably wouldn't get triggered, but if it's new development, that fee would be taken forth. I think the key here, though, is counting them. And that's something that if they're taking up a Measure D certificate, if they're being counted towards your 1% limit, and we're studying build out with our LCP, I feel that you're going to be accommodating them within the total growth. And in fact, these are units that are tend to have much lower trip generation rates and occupancy rates than the house. So by counting them, you could actually be displacing single-family development's ability to get certificates in a particular year and end up with smaller development. So I think I think it's too nuanced to know the outcome, but counting them matters.
Yeah, I have thoughts about that, but I'd really like to hear about the public's perception before I opine. But thank you. What about the relationship with other ordinances? For example, 2 neighborhoods in our town have a nighttime permit parking ordinance or permit parking requirement. So if we exempt people in ADUs from parking and we say they don't have to provide their parking off of the public street, they're on the street, do they need to have a permit if the public already has the maximum number of permits for that home? There seems like there's a nexus. My general theme of questions is about these nexuses. Nexi?
Sure. So state law actually contains another exemption for areas where there are public parking permit programs. We have yet to study this thoroughly, so I don't have a complete answer for you on this. And I appreciate the question, and we can look into that further. In general, as I said before, the goal is really to try and, the state's goal is to reduce these sorts of restraints on ADU development. But we can look into whether the city can require those permits for ADUs. So.
I'll withhold my remaining questions. That was helpful. Thank you.
Any other clarifying questions? John?
I'm really impressed with how you put this package together. I mean, for years I've worked in this area, and the way you've distilled the information is just great, because it's pretty random stuff. A question I have is, well, and also I'm assuming that, and I think we've said this in the report, that the purpose of the ADU is to expand the flexibility for the homeowners. So it's not necessarily just as a rental unit. There's extended family problems. There's all kinds of challenges with a lot of our housing inventory that just doesn't fit with the current needs of families. So I'm making that assumption. A question I have is, if there's are you visioning in the ordinance we're crafting, if there's a project that doesn't fit for some reason or other, the exemption or the ministerial process that you're going to do, what would be the process for some kind of exception? What would that be? Yeah.
So the city's existing code contains a variance clause, essentially saying that if you don't meet the existing standards, then you can go through a variance. That's completely consistent with state law, and so I would think that the city would continue to retain that clause to allow something that doesn't meet this setbacks or height, or needs special modifications for the lot that it's located in to be able to move forward.
Thank you.
Actually, I'd like to hear from the public. I have some, of course, comments and ideas, but see what the public says. I want to incorporate those afterwards, so I'm going to hold off until then.
All right, I'm going to move to public comment. For those of you who would like to, who have a green sheet, if you'd like to provide one of those to us, we're happy to take your comments. They're flooding in. I think we're going to set a record for, we're going to have to go back to the Half Moon Bay track project to get this many comment cards. So I will start with Dave Olson. Please click on the button so the green light is showing, and speak into the microphone, and if you would so kindly state your name.
My name is Dave Olson. I'm currently chair of the Midcoast Community Council, but I'm speaking in as an individual tonight. I fully support counting Measure D for ADUs. I also support not charging for them. I think that they do contribute to growth, they do contribute to impact, and I want to make a very clear point that ADUs do not displace other houses for build out. They displace them for build out within a given time frame, which is important. But a build out, we went through this quite a bit with the county. Build out is forever. and the highways are not probably going to change. I want to make one other point as well, which is covered somewhat under the short-term rental thing, but the county explicitly said ADUs cannot be used for short-term rental in the ADU ordinance. I think that you guys, ADUs may not be used for short-term rentals, period. And I believe that belongs in the ADU ordinance. And one other item is legalization of currently unpermitted ADUs. County's handling that as a separate program. You may want to consider it in your ordinance up front rather than doing it later.
Thank you. Tim Pond, and then you'll pass. Okay. I've never known you to be shy before. Followed by Kirsten Hagan.
My name is Tim Pond, and I live here in Half Moon Bay in Alsace-Lorraine. It's on? Okay. So I don't really understand that. And secondly, I think that we should encourage less car use overall. In my neighborhood, we have people that have 5 or 6 cars and they're on the street everywhere. And I think cars, I don't know if an additional ADU with 1 bedroom is going to be as big a problem as people that park multiple cars on the streets for long periods of time and have 3 or 4 cars. So I think some kind of car ordinance in general would help. I actually designed an ADU for somebody in Half Moon Bay, and I found that the process was fairly easy to go through, and they got a nice space out of it. And the only thing I can suggest is that the building department look at regulatory changes because of the cost of, if you want to make an ADU in an existing residence, you're going to have to make it conform to all the noise and fire rating issues of a duplex. That's nearly impossible to do without huge expense. So especially the noise transmission, the SDC, the sound transmission characteristics, some exemptions should be in place for that. In some places you'd have to pour gypcrete on a floor if it was above another unit, or disassemble the existing house to a point where no one could live in it for a period of time. And I think for the most part, that this isn't really necessary in most conditions, that you can get close to STC levels without major modifications. The new codes on STC levels are very strict for duplexes, and you have to reach a level which is hard to attain even in new construction. I have a space in my house I'd like to convert to an ADU, but I have a very old house and I don't actually have a driveway. I have a house that was built in 1880 over here, and I currently have a small family living in 2 of the bedrooms, and they share a kitchen with me sometimes. And because of the parking restriction and the fire issues, they're totally legally living there, and they've lived there for a while, and there's a door between the units, so there's no question. I live in a 4-bedroom, 3-bath house, pretty much alone. And the fact that these restrictions are here are preventing me from going in for the process of actually making this into an ADU. So anyway, thanks.
Thank you, Tim. As always, you've informed the public debate. Judy Taylor. Sorry, I skipped you. Kirsten, followed by Judy Taylor.
Okay, it's on, right? I'm Kirsten Hagan. I live in Half Moon Bay. And my question is about the occupancy, the deed restriction regarding occupancy. I don't understand why that is a requirement. The county does not require that. It's not, they don't address it in their ADU policy at all. And it seems quite limiting to both the owner who adds the ADU and to any future owner. So I don't know if that's a question for clarification or just something to discuss. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll direct back to city staff after we close public comment.
Good evening, Judy Taylor. I live in El Granada, but I'm in your offices a lot. Basically, there's a philosophical thing that I'd like to bring up here. And the whole reason that the state has come down with these rules around ADUs is because there have been some unreasonable obstacles to people providing additional housing within their homes. And so rather than approaching this with, do we have to, or let's tweak this and, put these restrictions around it, if you're getting 3 applications a year, my God, that is nothing. That is nothing. And you should be rolling out the red carpet and saying, what can we do to get more of these? Because every ADU is a private person providing affordable housing with no public participation. And, Portland has done a phenomenal job with their ADUs, and they do not have the affordability problem that not quite the affordability problem, but anyways. Okay, so a couple of other things. Restricting ADUs in any of your zoning districts, particularly industrial. The reason that they started allowing caretakers in Princeton was that they found that some 24-hour residential presence cut down on crime. So that's something to take into consideration. When you're talking about when you're talking about these kinds of ordinances, please remember that one of the things that draws most of us to the coast side is that we're different, eclectic, and when you have eclectic, you have odd things, so trying to make odd things fit into boxes usually doesn't work. So please build in a lot of flexibility in what you're doing here. Particularly with legalizing existing buildings. With the occupancy, we have people that put ADUs in their home and do it legally, and then they have to leave the area for some period of time. I am not aware of a lot of problems with these properties being a problem with out-of-area owners any more than any other rental. And so I would say, why is this restriction really necessary? Because if somebody does leave the area, you're telling them they have to sell their house. They may want to come back someday. And if there is anything in here that you change that have impacted prior people, there's no reason why you can't reverse the conditions and restrictions that were put on prior people. And, just the biggest thing is ADUs provide community for people. There's less isolation. There are lots of reasons why people do them. Please look for ways to encourage this to happen rather than putting boxes around just because the box is there. Thank you.
Followed by Scott
Lawrence.
Findley.
My name's Lawrence Mataisi. I'm also a property owner here in Half Moon Bay. This lady took the word out of my mouth as well, which was the restriction on having to be owner occupancy if you have to move, because you may move out of the area for some reason or another. The other question I had was for the floor area ratio, which you were addressing, but also looking at some of the codes. Like, for instance, I find out researching that basements are also against your floor area ratio, which I understand San Mateo County's not. Why would they have that? That's kind of below grade. And also, how about, just for regular development? Why do we have, 0.5 instead of 0.53? It really doesn't give you any benefit for the neighborhood, but it just impacts people's projects. You're always limiting what you can do with your house. You have restrictions of 0.35 and 0.5 on the ratio on the lot. You got your light plane window covering. It really protects the character of the property. And I think just putting that restriction in just impacts a person that's trying to build. And I'd like to see that relaxed on, all the properties. So, thank you.
Thank you. Scott?
Hi, I'm Scott Finley. I currently own a home at 41 Alameda in Half Moon Bay. I'm currently living in Pacifica, trying to get back to Half Moon Bay without displacing my tenant. So I have a detached structure in my backyard that was, in the past, was a detached garage. It's a perfect structure to build an ADU. I've got a plan in place. I've met with planning. Unfortunately, my setback is 3.5 feet too close to the rear property line. So I'm totally in favor of adapting the state law that says existing structures that are already there, they're not being torn down. Why not convert them to an ADU without having more impact and tearing it down, using resources and rebuilding them? The other thing, I did see a slide come up, but I didn't see it addressed, was the utility connections. I saw something about not having restrictions on new utility connections. Right now, Half Moon Bay's second unit law doesn't require a new water connection, but it requires a new water meter. Since most of these units are going to be built in the rear of the existing structure, putting a new meter at the front of the house and then trenching it all the way back to the ADU is really cost prohibitive. You're either going to have to go underneath the foundation, through a driveway, tear up your driveway, tear up a patio that's existing, tear up landscaping. Why not tie into a rear water spigot or water pipe that's already at the back of the house to feed the ADU? I think that's a very restrictive part of the existing ADU or second dwelling unit ordinance that currently exist. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Are there any other public comments? Seeing none, I'll close public comments and bring back to Planning Commission. We had a question around deed restrictions for occupancy that came up. I'd like to redirect back to city staff.
Well, just when you think one particular topic isn't going to be the big deal, it's the big deal. So that's very helpful. Thank you. That's your code right now. And it's pretty common, as I noted, in other cities, and it is allowed by state law. But you don't have to require that. So that is certainly up for discussion with the Planning Commission. It's why we highlighted it, because we know that it's something that you can make another choice about. And through the chair, I wanted to note, because we did not deliver this as the presentation that we had a couple meetings ago, and I doubt any of you were here, where we talked about the values around ADUs and community character, flexibility for supporting residents to stay in their homes, considering all kinds of different family changes over time, et cetera, et cetera. So we definitely had that context discussed with our Planning Commission, and it's nice to hear it reflected by the community members too. But I have to say it because we're not ignoring that, and this isn't just doing an ordinance. It's just that we're at this step. So that's why we're having the PowerPoint with all the bullet points. So thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Did you want to talk about the deed restrictions for occupancy? Did you want to? That was a question that was raised. I don't know if it's just what's in there, and you mentioned it, but is there a purpose for it?
Well, most cities saw conservatively in their codes that are probably decades old, were trying to protect the character of single-family residential neighborhoods. Almost all the old zoning codes come from that mindset of the sanctity of the light yellow color on your zoning map. And there was worry about having an ADU with a house behave in a way that didn't fit. And whether or not that is actually a legitimate concern, I don't know. I live in a neighborhood, there's ADUs all over it, and they're fabulous. So I personally really open-minded about it. It's just we came in real conservative with a number of the suggestions today in both of these discussions, because we're leveraging and taking cues from your existing code and trying to understand the community context and character. But if you think you've moved past that, or in a different direction, or we don't have it right, that's A-okay.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I'm going to bring it back to discussion for the Planning Commission, or unless you guys have other clarifying questions you'd like to ask staff. Les?
You know, the proof is in the ordinance. I mean, you know, here you're asking us for guidance, and I mean, I have ideas, but until I see it in black and white, certainly it's going to be hard to argue pro and con, and certainly I've heard from the audience here. From a concept standpoint, I think it's great, but we can make it very difficult, which means we won't see many if that's what we want, or we can make it easy. And again, that's something that not sure what the city planners, council, and so on want to do here. So I just want to kind of bring that up. But saying that, I've certain questions, concepts. If we, as planners, approve a house 5 years ago, and that house conforms to FAR, conforms to easement, it conforms to front yard, backyard sentiment, the question that I'm asking myself is, well, if you want to build an ADU here, now should we allow you to change that? The question also comes up is, will that be used for people who say, hey, you didn't let me do this 5 years ago, now I'm going to do an ADU. And yeah, it's an ADU, but in effect, it means a larger home for me or my kid or something like that. You know, so that's something I think I'm concerned about. The other thing is, as somebody brought up, tax revenues. If we add a family here and the kids go to school, you know, by adding an ADU, does that change the assessment, and do we get more school tax, for example? You know, again, that's a question. I don't have an answer to that. I mean, I agree with what some people said as far as making this part of a Measure D, because it can, in fact, it adds. So, and I don't think that's a constraint, at least not recently, might be in the future. So I would certainly check that off going forward. Water meter, yeah, I agree. I mean, why? You know, I mean, that seems absurd unless you want to make it really hard or really costly. I also agree with the idea that if something we want to do, that we ought to waive Measure D costs. And the other issue that came up is if you do a ADU, is it grandfathered based upon the code at the time the house was built, or do you got to put new sprinkler systems and everything, this and that? I mean, that's an issue. If we want it up to current code, I think that means we're not going to have many. So, again, that's something I just want to lay on the table, and I'd like to see it come back, and then we can debate. Last question that came to my mind is, what if I move a mobile home on my lot and use that as a ADU? I mean, is that going to be legal if it's under 700 square feet? You could say, well, no. Well, how about if I build a prefab on it? I mean, again, I'm looking for something that either somebody else put in their code that kind of either says, yes, this is something you can do or can't. So these are kind of issues. I'm obviously not offering you guidance. I'm kind of raising questions over here that I kind of like to see that perhaps the commissioners can debate when they see the ordinance written up. So for now, those are my comments.
Thank you, Les. John?
Sometimes I get stuck trying to do solutions when we haven't really defined the problems and the goals. And so trying to keep in the context of the goal, which is to allow more density in different ways. Is that I kind of get that right? And it seems pretty clear that whatever we do with the ADU ordinance that someone's doing in a building that already exists and they're not going to do much to it. Somebody might want to add a bay window and may need some complicated variance or something, I don't know. But that's not a particular problem. I think the challenge that we're facing right now is if someone wants to make a building bigger or there's not an existing detached building on the property, how do we work with a regulation that needs to fit the sort of irregularity of our coast side? One of the things we're challenged with right now is our zoning codes are uniformly applied to every neighborhood. Setbacks, daylight planes, all of that kind of stuff. There's subtle variations, but not much. And so we get kind of uniform solutions. And it seems like when we kind of narrow down to communities that at least I seem to really enjoy are communities that have visual variety to them and they feel differently. You know, it's not like Daly City where everything's kind of the same, you know. And so with that in mind, as we craft this ordinance going forward, it seems like there ought to be a mechanism to have some percentage or formula that we could be working with. So if someone's going to make a house bigger or add a second unit, a second structure on the property, if it doesn't fit whatever the particular regulation is supposed to be, whether it's floor area ratio or side yards or heights or whatever, there's also some discretionary percentage that we could be working with that doesn't make a dramatic impact and makes a project possible to do. And that seems like that would make our ordinance way more flexible. And I don't have a percentage number. I think that needs to be kind of more carefully looked at and probably is different depending on what the exception is. You know, if it's going to be, 25 and feet 6 inches higher, then it's okay. You know, if it's 35 feet higher, then that's probably not okay. There's going to be some reasonableness to that. What was brought up at a workshop that I was allowed to go to that the county put on, and I think we haven't talked about it, is the potential if somebody has a house and they want to put an ADU in it, because they're not changing the house, but they also want to put an ADU on the property and build a separate structure. Why can't they do that? So then we'd maybe potentially have 2 ADUs on the same property. And that may or may not be useful. If we're looking at density and we're looking at what are the problems created, I mean, we're all kind of sensitive to growth, as undefined as that is. And if growth means more people or more cars or bigger buildings, but right now our challenge is how do we get more density without dramatically changing the character of our neighborhoods? I think that's what I hear us saying here. And so I think that it's worth at least talking about. And I think it was a question in my mind about if this is intended to be single family properties, then why are we looking at the R2 and R3 districts? Because those are duplexes or triplexes or more dense, and why would someone that has a property that's a zone for duplex, why would we want to do that?
Through the chair, just a quick note. We do have a number of fairly small R2 and R3 lots that are developed with single-family homes that really can't fit a full, duplex unit and meet the parking. The ADU standards are more relaxed, and so it actually does give an option. It might not be the best option for all of them, but it is an option that some of them would like.
So it's the inappropriate zoning district to begin with.
It happens a lot.
The subdivisions don't always fit the zoning that's been imposed on top of it.
That eclectic variety.
Well, I also think we have some historical artifacts within the R2 and R3 districts where we actually have single-family residences.
Sure.
So, I think that this addresses those artifacts.
And I also like the, as you probably would expect, the idea that on a property where there's a building that has a significant character that we're trying to protect here, we call that historic right now. And right now our definition of historic is more than 50 years. So my house is kind of historic, you know. Yeah. I'm older than Israel, you know, so. Yeah, so I'm not sure, does that need to come into our discussion? And I'm anxious to not open an area that's going to be too complex. But, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Jimmy?
So thank you for the comments. And I think just to piggyback on some of the comments that Les and John had made, I appreciate the concern about, he echoed the concern of my clarifying question about infrastructure. And I think, you know, and John gave a more increasingly nuanced definition of what we were trying to do. First, I think he said it was create more density, and then it was create more density without impacting to paraphrase, the quality of the neighborhood. And I think I just would want to articulate, to put a sharper point on that, it is to create more affordable density in a way that doesn't impact the neighborhood. I think if I understand the state rules, the concerns that are in the preambles of these laws, it's not just about creating more big houses, it's about creating more affordable living. And otherwise, I agree with your sense of the nature of the problem. And I appreciate that some of these areas are really complex. I'd like to return to the infrastructure question, because I appreciate that we don't want to create a artificial impediment for allowing affordable development in our community. At the same time, I think it's really important for us to look at the momentum of thinking about development in a vacuum with respect to the capacity of the community. I think Cape Town is an excellent example of what can go wrong if you ignore the potential for a catastrophe. You're probably, I believe or is it Johannesburg, the day zero syndrome, where they are literally not going to have any water. No water. Think about that. You know, but it's not just water, it's not just sewer, it is roadways, and the Coastal Commission has made comments with respect to the way that we develop. And in reading their November memo, I think that they acknowledged the objective of housing, but they stood, I thought, quite firm on implementing the provisions of the Coastal Act. And those twin pillars are the protection of coastal resources and coastal access. If the farmer from Fresno can't get here, that's not consistent with the Coastal Act. And I don't think they just rolled over and said, that's okay, we'll look the other way. So I want to be sure that while I support the objective of affordable housing, that we do it in a way that is consistent with the Coastal Act. There's also concern about other resources in my mind. Another important utility is power. And anybody who's ever tried to put a larger panel in their home or has developed in an area where the power lines are close to their capacity has probably had the experience of PG&E saying you have to dig up your service entry cable and put in a giant thing, you know, R20 or something like that. And it's not that I want those to be impediments. It's that I don't want us to live in a silo of saying we want more housing. By law, we're not going to consider those other impacts. I think we need to be really honest about those impacts. The speaker from the Mid-Coast, Mr. Olson, pointed out that Measure D does not changed the build-out targets. It regulates the rate. And the intention of Measure D, when it was passed, was to give the city an opportunity to react to its growth rather than facing a tsunami of growth. The way this ordinance, in my mind, could be written, it would be nice for us to have an ability to adapt to unforeseen impacts so that we could look and say, wow, we just saw 60%, and this won't happen, but we just saw 60% of our R1 districts decide that it costs them nothing or next to nothing to pursue an ADU, and what would that impact be? So I think the general theme that I'd like to address is that our ordinance be sensitive to the side effects with respect to our resources. We do have some PUDs, as you mentioned, that have developed with homes. I think Spyglass was a PUD, Ocean Colony, Jenna Lane, and some of those, if we applied the county standard for how big they could get, you know, the 35, 50% thing, whichever is that, or 800 feet or whatever it was, 750, whichever is bigger. Some of those homes, you know, at the end of Correas or in Jenna, I mean, these are 5,000, 6,000 square foot homes. I don't know if they actually got to 6,000. I think we'll see. But, you know, half of that doesn't look like affordable housing to me. So I'm looking for a little more drilled out. I mean, the goal, you know, it is fine for the property owner to profit, but our model of achieving the state's objective of affordable housing, to me, should be a limitation on that. And I appreciate the concerns of the public with respect to owner-occupied. And I appreciate the answer you gave with respect to that being to protect the character of the community. That's already an issue with respect to short-term rentals. I don't know if any of you live next to Airbnb. It might have worked great for you. For some people, it hasn't worked so well. And so I think there is the potential for that. The intention, I think, was that if the owner is there, they can kind of keep an eye on it and try to understand how that process is going, as opposed to absentee landlord, you know, the property goes to hell in a handbasket. And so if we were not going to implement an owner-occupied model, I would like to understand what we could use to ensure that we have not created a real adverse impact, a blight of development within a neighborhood. And I would look to the home office regulations as a possible inspiration for thinking about how we approach that question. I'm not saying that I think it's the right answer. It may be that the right answer is to require some level of owner occupancy, although as our population ages, that may become infeasible. So I'm open to thinking about that. But I do think that the underlying goal of avoiding a blight situation in the middle of a neighborhood because the owner isn't there, you know, if there are other ways to achieve that, fine, but let us bear that in mind. ADUs and PUDs in the examples that were completed, but also in urban reserve and open space reserve. That's tricky, and I just want to be sure that we're clarifying what we'd be achieving there. If we have an undeveloped PUD, I don't think I'd have to go back and look, but I don't think there's an entitlement to develop. So putting an ADU there wouldn't apply, if I recall the rules correctly. On the other hand, in our urban reserve and open space reserve areas, if it's a large parcel, and that is, I believe, there are minimum lot sizes, or lot sizes? They have to be big. And in those cases, I think there is a rule that allows one development, one home in those areas, with provisions that say it can't be on an ESHA or destroy farmland or prime ag space and things like that. And as I understand what you'd be envisioning here, that would allow one ADU on top of that one entitlement. Okay, just wanted to be sure I understood what was envisioned there. Let me collect my thoughts while Rick has what he has to say. I may want to reload with a few more thoughts here. Thank you.
I'll try to be as brief as possible so you don't reload. Just kidding. So why are we here? Going back to the original goal that you raised, right? We've got a housing crisis in the Bay Area. Homes are not affordable. The state's asked us to change our approach so that we can streamline the process of building secondary dwelling units. We're asked to provide guidance so that we can make this a ministerial process, and we've been given the template of San Mateo County's zoning ordinance as a model for something to look at. So I looked at that. I think as a template, it's perfectly fine. I think there are items that we can discuss and quibble about, but the question you asked us, what do we think of this? I think this is a really good template for us, and there are some gaps that we're going to need to fill, but I think that, in my mind, I think that's a good starting point. I don't know why we have deed restrictions for occupancy. You gave us some reasons. To me, we're not living in an area where we are necessarily as worried about that, so I don't see that being something necessary moving forward, and I haven't heard any public comment actively supporting it. I get wary around legalizing existing buildings. I think that's something that should be treated separately outside of the context of what we're doing here, just because the sheer number of structures that sit in people's backyards, and they've been there for 20 years, 30 years, whatever. I think I would have some concerns about addressing that here. I don't see a need for new water meters. I think that, again, we don't need to be imposing excessive fees on applicants. I guess the question I had, if I could redirect back to staff, why do we charge for a Measure D permit today? Is it to cover the city's costs?
It's part of a fee study and actual amount of staff time to process the certificate.
Does a Measure D for a secondary dwelling unit have the same type of cost?
I think we could just make it part of the building permit approval or some other way.
So it would be a smaller fee?
Yeah,
but
it would be, we could simplify it.
Okay,
Yeah.
I think
Yep.
that would be a reasonable approach to take. My view is I like to be really clear, approaching single-family dwellings, R1, R2, R3. That makes a lot of sense for single-family dwellings, and make sure we get the commas in the right place when we define that. I also think for developed PUDs, it makes sense to look at, again, single-family dwellings within developed PUDs. This also makes sense. I'm a little leery about somebody taking, if we're not careful with the open reserve, I would be a little leery about somebody aggressively interpreting law. So if we are going to do something around the open reserve spaces here, I can imagine, like, let's take Andrade's lot, right? I know that's been retired, but just as an example, somebody could, if we were not careful, you could open up a can of worms and somebody could build a massive structure on the lot. So I would just be cautious about amending the ADUs for open reserves, and maybe we just have a variance people have a variance process. So if they want to build something, they can still come to the planning commission, they can ask for a variance, and maybe that's the right thing to do rather than try to boil the ocean here. I don't really have you mentioned the 750 square feet versus the 800 square feet limit. I mean, again, most of the lots in Half Moon Bay are so small that it's not going to be an issue. To me, having consistency with the county, there's actually some value there, because then makes things easier for the developers, but I don't have a super strong opinion. I'm just trying to make it easier for folks. Okay, duly noted. I think, I do want to cover the concept of FAR. I mean, as eclectic as our neighborhoods are, I do think it serves a purpose of creating some kind of consistency of character, and it also, as we've covered in some of our previous projects that have come before us, it also improves the quality of the living space that we have. We're not Shanghai with 24 million people, or even San Francisco with 800,000 people, or Half Moon Bay with 13,000, right? And we have a very different type of thing we're going for here. So I do think that the FAR, especially the way that the county ordinance has approached this, where you're trying to be consistent with when you're looking at a secondary dwelling unit, you're trying to be consistent with the general development standards. I think that's a good approach, and I don't have any other comments or questions, so I'll direct back to Jimmy, since he's looks like he's ready to reload.
Thank you. I got faked out by the green red. When I looked, it was green. So my vision of how this could work is sort of a mini version of the neighborhoods in Palo Alto, off of University, away from University, where you've got some fairly deep lots, and you've got a driveway with it, goes back quite a distance, and there was a home, I'm guessing, that was built first closer to the back of the lot. And then a smaller home, maybe it was a garage, and a detached garage that was converted, or maybe it was never there and it got added later. Our lots are a lot smaller than that in many cases, maybe not all. But there are some deep lots where I could imagine something like that happening. And I just want to get clarity in my mind as to that's kind of a vision of how you think it might work in some cases at least, or whether there's something about that really doesn't work here.
So what we're seeing for detached structures, because there's not a lot of development in Half Moon Bay with detached garages. So mostly what we're seeing are small cottages with like a 10-foot rear yard setback. They consume about half of the rear yard, and the garage is not affected. Having an entrance to the unit needs to be accomplished. It's usually done with like a garden path down the side of the house, and they work really quite well. If the lots are wider, we're seeing the detached garage in some situations with the unit attached to it at 1 story, or actually a 2nd story, like a carriage house format with the ADU above the garage, which is allowed in Half Moon Bay. Some cities don't allow detached 2-story structures. So those are less common, though, than attached units or wholly within for some of our properties. There's quite a bit of a kind of push towards the attached. It's a lot easier to make them fit. So just lots of patterns. We don't have a lot of that old Palo Alto kind of.
Yeah, and I don't mean to be either derogatory nor
No.
worshipful about that.
No, it's just a different time frame. Yep.
Okay. Then when I read the November, or maybe it was the April guidance, I think, but I didn't see it change in the November guidance from the Coastal Commission. It seemed to suggest that if a home was conditioned in such a way that the ADU would change, would not be consistent with the coastal development permit, it would appear that they would require a coastal development permit.
They do. We don't think the approach to amending an existing coastal development permit is amenable here. It will be hard to dig them all up. None of them were conditioned, as far as I know, with respect to a potential future ADU.
Yeah, they typically would say things like, we're approving a house of a particular
Yep,
size.
this is what we approve.
And if we
Yep.
say you're going to build something that's bigger than that, that's not consistent with the conditions of that coastal development permit.
However, if our ADU, so that's the question that you have before you, whether or not additional square feet should be exempt or not.
Yeah, I'm asking what the Coastal Commission guidance says about that. I read that to say they think we need to revisit the CDP.
They do, but then they also say look for waivers and exemptions. We think they're really leaving it a little bit open for you to discuss and decide what you think is appropriate.
Okay,
we
so
really do.
having asked that question and appreciating that answer, this strikes me as a great space to lobby for a waiver opportunity. I can think of other cases in the city where the absence of a waiver could be difficult for someone who wants to do something that really has a de minimis impact. And if the state rules are saying that this kind of development is de minimis, then I would hate to see a relatively small change like this result in the triggering of a CDP. That said, I think it's really important as we craft this to show conformance with the Coastal Act and our local coastal program. That's absolutely essential from my perspective. There are homes, oh, I'm sorry, were you getting in?
I wanted to jump on that. I think that's actually a good point for a waiver. Having a de minimis of either the 750 or 800, whatever the limit is. I think that it addresses the core problem. It streamlines the process, and it makes people's job as a homeowner who wants to do something a lot simpler. And boy, not having to go to the Coastal Commission and deal with that whole process, that'd.
So full disclosure, the waiver process is subject to appeal. And I think that's an important safety valve. It's an incentive for the developer to do something that's not going to tick off their neighbors. And I think that's great. It's a lightweight process for getting truly de minimis things through. And that's why I think it's a good idea. There are, just to touch on some of the developed PUDs, I can think of some, for example, the Jenna Lane properties, where that development went through where we allowed two homes to be built on each lot, the way that proposal is going. And I think that those represent kind of magnificent accessory dwelling units. I mean, luxurious accessory. I think they called them guest houses in the subdivision CDP. And I don't know if you're envisioning that each of those would have an ADU, or whether you're thinking those are kind of ADUs, and get over it if you want to do more.
I'm not sure I know which specific property you're referring to, if it's one that you've seen recently.
They had the one on the corner of Jenna Lane that we just looked at that we
Okay,
kicked back.
so that
This isn't a new development. I mean, it's...
I know. Okay, so hold on. I'm trying to remember some of the specs on that. The existing structure on that property, surprisingly, the living space in it is within 700 square feet. It actually I think it looks big because it has an attached garage, and we wouldn't count the garage space towards the ADU space. So that's pretty unusual. Much bigger lot than any of the other ones that we're talking about. Jenna Lane is quite a one-off. We wouldn't see an ADU being associated with that unit. It's one house per lot with one ADU.
So
per
it
house.
effectively has implemented the ADU
Yes.
concept that we're trying to generalize for other parcels.
Yes.
Okay, I get it. That makes sense to me. And I think I have other comments, but I think you get the high-level picture of where I am on this. I think it's worthwhile if we're achieving the goal of affordable density without impacting the neighborhood in a way that is not ruinously expensive through processing. I think it's a grand idea, but I think we should be real about the impacts. And since we have had some ADUs go through. We haven't, I don't think we've called them that, but second units that have gone through, not a lot of them. It might be instructive if we could look at the record of resource consumptions at those sites and see what kind of water consumption, what kind of power consumption we saw before that was built and what it looked like after. Maybe that data is long gone, maybe it's private and none of our business. I respect that. But I think if we don't have the data, a good example of where we could stick our toe in the water is to monitor that. And if we find out that our assumption that somehow we have this increased density at no cost to our consumption of utility, fabulous. If we find out that it does have an impact, that notwithstanding the rules that we're not going to require a water connection, that we're actually using more water, that we're actually using more power, that we actually are increasing the number of students who are going to school from those places. I want to be sure our work on the local coastal program modifies its assumptions so that we don't outstrip our carrying capacity of those public structures. Thank you for being so patient with my comments.
Thank you. John?
I agree with Rick that the county's template is really a good starting point for us. On the PUDs, if we had a property in Half Moon Bay that's a PUD and let's say is part of a bigger PUD, and this particular parcel is maybe 4 or 5 acres, 6 acres, and there's already residences on that property, and there's also outbuildings like little animal shelters, and then also, let's say, a barn on that property, and that owner wanted to turn that barn into an accessory unit, but the barns, typically barns are, 1,000 square feet, 1,500 square feet. Would that be legitimate to be included in our ordinance, even though the size of that, because it's a building that's already there?
Well, I think that's the thing that I'm concerned about, right? Because that's not a developed PUD. It's you have a historical piece of like farmhouse sitting on a PUD. That's where I think that my take would be no. It's treated like, it's not a secondary dwelling unit. It just, you need to go through the planning commission, submit a project, and you're going to have to ask for a variance. That's how I would view that, or build within the existing law, but it's not an ADU. That's how I'd view it. Just because, I don't know, I get pretty imaginative about some things, and I know many people do. I can just see all kinds of terrible issues coming out of the undeveloped PUDs.
So our variances, is that, can you do variances in PUDs? I mean, and we're getting a little bit specific here, so
Yeah.
You don't need to go to a variance. I just think you can use the existing planning process to build a house there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really, we'd have to have facts of a case to really give you a good answer. There's a lot of interesting conditions out there, and we know that. We appreciate that.
Another comment that I feel I need to make here is that the reality, if we get down to the actual cost of doing any of these units, the actual physical construction cost, my experience is that unless somebody's amortizing that cost, if they're just doing out-of-pocket any of these ADUs, the rent doesn't pay them back for a long, long time. So unless they have like a chunk of money that was an inheritance or something like that. And so the more we can do to really minimize the upfront costs and the simplicity of doing this and easing the working around regulations, the more it's going to help us. And even if we create a demand of, excuse me, a demand of 10 times the units we're doing now, that's still only 40 units a year. So it's not really much of a dent in any of the impact on our community. And thanks again, Jill, for the format of this is great. Yeah. So.
Yeah, there was just one last thought, which is if I built my property out to the maximum floor area ratio, let's say, that I could get right now, and then the laws say you can have an ADU, and I want to do one on my parcel, a separate standalone unit. So the first question, under the proposed rules of the county, do I get some additional floor area ratio, or do I need to live within my floor area ratio requirements?
The county's ordinance says that you have to comply with all generally applicable zoning standards, and so in that case, I'm not super familiar with their FAR requirements, but I would imagine, and the way most cities work, is that in that example you've given, they would not be able to move forward.
And lot coverage, same thing?
Lot coverage, same thing.
Okay, the reason I'm concerned is I want to be sure, if someone has a way that's consistent with our zoning ordinances and they want to expand within the ordinance, I'm supportive. I do not want to create a back door that creates an opportunity to expand beyond what our zoning standards would allow in the name of, let's produce affordable housing. Oh, gee, nobody's buying, nobody's renting it. I guess I'll just occupy it in the meantime.
The one exception to that I would just mention is that the state law has some very obscure and specific requirements related to garage setbacks. You can see that in the chart that's attached to the report. So in general, cities can impose their standard setbacks to sort of all new ADU development, with the exception of ADUs that are added. Basically, usually it's on top of an existing garage requirement, and that's to sort of allow ADUs to be developed on garages that are non-conforming legal uses.
And I appreciate the comments that you made, Joe, earlier about that we wouldn't just look the other way if someone thought I'm going to put an ADU in the middle of an ISHA. What about ADUs? There are quite a few developments that are in the buffer areas of ISHAs. And I just would like to get clarity on whether you feel like since buffers have to be designed and sited so as to avoid adverse impacts, do you feel like that's a situation where a CDB is required, or would that be too expeditious or not expeditious?
No, we would absolutely require CDP for that. That's where you hit the Coastal Act square on, and that is where the state law kicks up to the Coastal Act. That's really clear to staff. And I do want to comment on the floor area ratio and the county code. That's how it works in the city code right now, and that's what we were proposing for an ordinance that would go forward. So just consistently with that.
Great, so I'll try to wrap this up. I agree with ignoring the JDUs. I think that makes sense. I do agree with using the measure D. I think that makes sense. It's logical, it's consistent with the language, and there's the preponderance of how the county, and we've historically done it, sort of matches up with that. I do like the idea of waiving or using the permit fee as opposed to the Measure D process. I think that makes life easier for the folks who live here. And then the only other concern I have is, as we look for something moving forward, is it's just the parking. I know we're moving to an era where one could argue we're going to need less parking. All of us read those types of things in our spare time. But the concern today is we have too much street parking. You look at some of the properties here, you've got 10 cars parked in front of a house, and it's just, we need to have a place for people to park their cars. We need to, or at least we need you guys to think about it a little bit more and just come back to it. I'll leave the details to you guys, but it's a concern. All right, and those are the only other comments I have. Thank you. And again, thank you for putting this together. As far as these things go, it was really readable and logical and digestible. Thanks. I'd like to request that we take a short recess for a couple minutes, and then we'll regroup.
think of it, our LCP, there's an earthquake that leveled all of that. I mean, to me, I'd love to see a livable downtown, with those commercial, residential, retail, and this and that. I mean, I'd love to see something like that, where it's sidewise.
So is, dropping the exchange from Louisa over to San Francisco, transparent. And you said they're renegotiating the lease right now. $63 a square foot. You can get $3 a square foot.
It's supply and demand.
I could get 10, I just retired or nothing. Milk the cow.
Paging Dr. Benjamin. Paging Dr. Benjamin. Yes.
So, if it's next door to me, 30 days for rentals. If it's down the road, it's 180 days. Right? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, that's what my neighbors, that was a comment. Next to me, 30 days. That's a big thing. And of course, I think the ADUs and rentals kind of, they kind of tie in a way.
I do. Well, I got a friend who, he says he pays about 70% of his mortgage with an accessory dwelling unit that he rents out. And like it's a historical thing. His house has been here for, at least 80 years. It's in Half Moon Bay. It's just down the street from me. And it's like, it's nice, basically, it's a big unit with a bed, and it's got a kitchenette, and it's got a loft for kids to climb up. He rents it on weekends. Yeah, it's Airbnb, yeah.
Well, yeah, but then there's management that goes with that.
But I mean, hey, it's,
He works from home.
$100 a week.
Yeah, nice. He's doing pretty well. He's actually doing more than that, but yeah, it's kind of. All right. All right, let's, you're welcome. Let's re-adjourn if we can, please. So we'd like to move on to the third item in our study session this evening. Jill, take it away.
Moving to short-term vacation rentals, we have a similar format, a shorter presentation, and looks like less public interest. It's on. Can you hear me? Okay. Tired. Okay. This is actually really consistent with the City Council listening sessions over the weekend. Last year, affordable housing and short-term rentals were both priorities that the council was looking into, and we're still in that year and working on both of those items. The community is still acutely interested in affordable housing, and we didn't get much input on short-term rentals. So staff has a goal of getting through this one and moving on, because we think it's quite a bit simpler, but again, what I predicted last time was wrong, so let's see what we do now. And also, again, Sarah was instrumental in pulling this research and the legal side of it together, and staff has given a lot of input in terms of what we've heard from the community and what we've observed with short-term rentals. Again, the Coastal Commission has guidance on this. They're especially fond of short-term rentals because they support coastal access, and they can be a lower-cost visitor-serving type of lodging. They don't require new development. That said, they defer to local discretion to work through what is appropriate for each community. Again, San Mateo County is a bit ahead of this. I believe they have gotten to the point of a pilot program, or an ordinance has been They're right about there. They're really close. It's helpful to us to see how they're going. So what are we doing now? Because we know that there are short-term rentals in Half Moon Bay, and how has that been working out? So currently, your zoning ordinance doesn't acknowledge this land use in the kinds of zoning districts where they're found, specifically the single-family zones and the PUDs. We have been challenged by saying whether they're allowed or not because of that, although we have this Coastal Commission guidance that is supportive of them, so we acknowledge that. The ones that are here, we have, the city has a consultant who does business license processing for us. They have also begun to enforce short-term rentals. They look for them on all the basic host sites that you see, the Airbnb, VRBO, et cetera. In our understanding of San Mateo County, 80% of the short-term rentals are on Airbnb, so you get a really good hit with that one. What they're looking for is to make sure that if they are out there, they get a business license and they're collecting TOT. But we're not doing any land use controls, we're not doing any building permit reviews, we're not doing any kinds of inspections, and also get quite a few complaints about some short-term rentals, and we can talk about that as we go, which ones seem to be more troublesome than others. Again, as with ADUs, we need to think about where they should be allowed and then what kinds of short-term rentals in which districts and what other kinds of land use controls you might want to consider for them. Like ADUs, they are located in existing residential developments, so you get the same cast of characters for zoning designations, your range of residential districts, mixed-use districts, and then the questions about urban reserve and open space. We happen to know there's already quite a few short-term rentals operating in some of the city's planned unit development neighborhoods. Types. This is probably the biggest question we want to ask you tonight is hosted versus unhosted rentals. The complaints that that staff receives that that come into my email box are about unhosted short-term rentals. They are the ones where the whole house is rented out, and it could even be a situation where it's a second home and the owner is rarely, if ever, there, and it's just cycling through and being rented out. I think we listed the kind of the typical nuisance types of concerns that are associated with that, from noise and parties and garbage and traffic, etc. So hosted, I have not gotten a single complaint about a hosted rental. We know that we have some because we looked at all of them on Airbnb and elsewhere, and those don't get reported to us. That's where the owner is home and is renting a room, and it could be a little suite, a room with a bathroom and its own entrance, but those are not coming up. So just want to note that. The other thing, is, aside from types, is what kind of residential unit should they be allowed in? And I want to say this, and we'll get a little deeper in a couple slides. Staff came in really conservatively with this, and there's a few reasons why. We were taking a cue from our home occupation standards, which are designed to ensure that any commercial business in a residential neighborhood is substantially subordinate to the neighborhood residential purpose. And when you compare those standards to how a short-term rental would operate, it's really intense relative to a home occupation, or a home occupation, assuming that it meets the city's standards. So that's why we came in this way, relative also to the complaints that we have received and the complaints that we have not received. So that said, there's other ways to go, and we'll talk about some pros and cons. The other piece, though, where staff is, we're trying to be clear that this is just our initial suggestions, but there is one thing where we want to be a little bit stronger. We would recommend very strongly that we not allow short-term rentals in certain types of housing that are meant to be affordable, specifically accessory dwelling units, rental multifamily development, and mobile homes. So we just are really concerned about losing that housing inventory to this other, more of a commercial use. We need all three of those types of housing. What some other cities have done, and we suggested here having hosted rentals in the residential zones and allowing unhosted in our mixed-use zoning, because we already have similar uses functioning together in those mixed-use zones, and it's already distinguishes the character of those areas. And so that was our initial just first cut at it. That said, quite a few other jurisdictions are allowing unhosted short-term rentals in single-family zoning districts, but they're putting some controls on them. They're limiting the nights per year, or which is reasonably enforceable. They're limiting occupancy, and we would suggest doing that as well. They're showing proof of residency. That's something that we can talk more about, because the last item I was surprised about. The one that I'm really nervous about, though, would be limiting the total number, because what you could have happen is you could establish quite a few short-term rentals, and maybe they're not really used for it, and they're taking up those slots, and it's hard to get them to maybe extinguish their count. It's a big mess right now in Pacific Grove. They have more short-term rentals occupying than the number that they are going to approve, and they're possibly going to go into a lottery. Just for the administrative component of that, I would really not want to see us have to add that on to the work that we're doing. It just, I think we can control this in other ways. I don't think that's the best way to do it. So just a couple more things, just so you know the context. Right now we're aware of 33, and most of them are compliant with TOT. And in our first year of actually enforcing this, and this is ramped up from quarter to quarter, so we would expect more, but we took in, I dropped the dollar sign, it's supposed to be $80,000. And a couple other things going on in the county climate for this. The San Mateo County 21 Elements group that supports the housing elements locally is very concerned about the impact of short-term rentals diminishing, taking away from our housing inventory, and thereby affecting housing affordability. And so they have been studying short-term rentals, and in fact are considering going into an agreement with Airbnb, similar to the way this city and county of San Francisco did, acknowledging that there's no individual jurisdiction in San Mateo County that could probably have a unique agreement with Airbnb, because we're all so much smaller. But if the county did it as a whole, that could be helpful. What that would accomplish is, if we had terms from Airbnb or any of the other platforms, that they would do some monitoring of nights per year, and they would list the business license on the site. They would make sure the TOT is getting conveyed, et cetera, et cetera. So there's an advantage to having that done. However, even if that agreement doesn't come into place, the other jurisdictions in the county are doing what we're doing. You hire a compliance specialist, and you can do this on your own. It's just you're not getting direct support from the particular platform. But I just wanted to note that because we brought this to you for focusing on the land use. This slide is very little to do about the land use, but we want you to be aware that we have a lot of information about this, and we would develop all of these components to administration and enforcement in any ordinance that was to come forward. So, as I mentioned before, we started conservatively. We're really interested in your feedback about that. We think any ordinance that would permit short-term rentals would be in support of allowing for more coastal access, and so that is an important component of this. We also note it's possible that the conservative approach would be maybe found to be a little bit too restricted, and we wouldn't get the TOT that we might hope for from this. Also, I kind of alluded to in that lottery comment, we're really looking for some very clear-cut boundaries around this to just keep it simple in terms of implementing and enforcing as a starting point, remembering that you don't have anything now at all and they're operating, and to be able to add a layer to it and give it a little time to see how it's working. I think an incrementalist approach could be appropriate here, but we're all ears to what you're looking for. These are kind of what we were thinking about, these other land use controls. And that's all I have on this one. And Sarah, did I miss anything significant? Okay.
Great. Do you have any clarifying questions? Okay, wow. Do you have a sense of how much of the TOT revenue comes from hosted versus unhosted properties? Okay, that's fine. I'm going to open it up for public comment. I don't see any. I see one green card, but Tim already left. Oh, you put one in as well? Oh, please.
Dave Olson, El Granada, Chair of the Mid-Coast Community Council, but speaking as an individual. I was one of a small group of people that got the short-term rental process in San Mateo County started. I worked on it for coming up on 4 years now. It is completely through the Coastal Commission. It's in the last stages of implementation at planning and building, and when the fees are approved, then it will go into effect. I do want to say that between 10-15% of the rental units, by my count, in the Mid-Coast are now listed at least part-time as short-term rentals. That has a significant impact on housing availability for renters. There is constant demand for rental on the Mid-Coast, and we don't have it. You may or may not have that big an impact here. Parking, huge issue. We pushed for stronger parking restrictions than the county implemented. When we started the process, there were 2 short-term rentals in a neighborhood. Then there were 3. Now there are 6 within a block of my friend who started this with me. That has a big impact on quality of life in that neighborhood. Most jurisdictions that are on their second, I don't think there are any yet on their 3rd iteration, are getting more restrictive, not more general. Santa Cruz County has limited number of units in some of their coastal areas on their 2nd version. I really think you should see if that's going to be an issue in Half Moon Bay, and if so, try for it. I pushed very, very hard to have the county put in the same terms that San Francisco did for enforcement with Airbnb, but it was all still in the courts at that point. They weren't willing to consider it. Now that it's been through the courts and Airbnb has caved and is caving in other jurisdictions, I really think you should get that into your ordinance and plan on enforcing it. Obviously, you're not going to be suing Airbnb, but they have started to be compliant, so I think that's a good thing. If you're not going to require hosted, at least do what the county did and require a manager to be within 20 minutes, 24 hours a day. That does seem to help. Most of the impact we see on the Mid-Coast is not loud parties. It's just the impact of constantly having people coming and going. Very disruptive of a residential neighborhood. Thanks.
Thank you. We have another person who'd like to speak. Go ahead and you can fill out the green form later. Please state your name.
Yeah, I'm Lance Dumond, and I'm in El Granada as well, and we host, and it's truly not for the faint of heart. So, and I really appreciate the all the open conversation here. So I think that's super healthy and very excited to be here. The I am interested. I like the hosted unhosted discussion. I think that's really healthy. I too am not a fan of unhosted. I think that's, I mean, I can give you great stories, and I can give you a little more exciting, spicy stories over the last year and a half, and would love to, anybody that wants to be entertained, they're good stories. They're all positive. The I do particularly like some type of manager within, you know, perhaps that's as long as you can get from over the hill. Like in our case, we have got an old aunt, and we're constantly going to Sunnyvale. So as long as, like, we're paranoid, we're like the neighborhood watch freaks because we're concerned about noise, we're concerned about trash, we're concerned about parking. We got our next door neighbor orange cones so we can have his spot out front. So I worry about those same things, which I think is really important. I would love to learn more about Portland. I think we've got, I would consider them somewhat like a sister city, like keep Portland weird, keep Half Moon Bay eclectic to a certain extent. So maybe that's a new tagline. I have 6 daughters, so that affordability and getting coastal access is huge. Like, they could not afford to come here and spend time. They're all 18 plus, so a lot of exciting stories there as well. We really host the locals. So what we do is we had this wonderful group of 5 teachers that came in from Oakland over the weekend. It's mostly Oakland, Fremont, Sacramento. Like, we get a lot of locals that are just basically coming over the hill for the weekend, which is really exciting. We have to do it to pay taxes. So we're from Minneapolis, and I'm mindful of the time here, and we had to move again to take care of my aunt, and it was somewhat basically financial suicide. So to pay those taxes, it's just part of survival of the fittest here. I do think there's that third option. I think requiring that primary residence, I think, is critical. That makes it just keeps us on the hook. I mean, we're already is our primary residence, so we live there every living second because we'd rather be here 24 hours. We just, 24/7, but we can't get there. So I think that primary resident, again, not a fan of unhosted. I just can't see that working. So I think it's that proof of application of that primary residence with the license. We don't allow parties, ever. I think that's it. But I'd love to continue the discussion. I'm very healthy. I appreciate all the research and would like to learn more, and I think it's a good debate.
Thank you. So if we go, what's our time limit for the evening? We go past 10 o'clock? So I'm going to go for another, I'm going to let things run for another 10 minutes, and we'll see where we end up before I make a motion. So 10:30. Okay, so I'm going to open it for discussion.
So as I understand it, Jill, we're being asked not philosophically about short-term rentals, but more specifically where they would be appropriate and where they wouldn't. So it's this kind of overwhelming question in my mind. Is there some facts-based way that we could make these decisions and not just, well, I think it'd be good there and not good there? I mean, is there some way to develop information and facts, and we can just say, okay, based on these facts, it makes sense in this district and not in this district? Can we do something like that?
We can try to. I thought we did a little bit. Clearly, we didn't do enough. Let's talk for a minute about single family, because I think that's a fair place to start, because that's where most of the short-term rentals are operating right now. They're predominantly in single family neighborhoods on the west side of Highway 1. And yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, Jill, but I understand that. I mean, we're being asked to make suggestions of how to actually limit. I mean, it's already understood that they're being done in residential
right
districts, and I guess we're saying, great. Do you also want then, with these different conditions, is that the Planning Commission's
I think the
job?
question is, do you think they're compatible with those zoning districts in those neighborhoods where they're operating? And what I don't know is if you are aware of, you may know about some. I know I've spoken with a couple of the planning commissioners about things they've heard about short-term rentals over the last year. So we're hoping you're bringing your own kind of experience of town to the discussion. But this is a land use question about, in particular, neighborhood compatibility, which is why we were looking at the home occupancy or home occupation standards of limiting traffic and noise and no signage, et cetera, and really you have no idea that there's a business in the house as sort of this kind of the basis of where we're going from there, and how much more could be done in terms of a commercial business that would still be compatible with the neighborhood. And is there a point where there's too much activity or too many of them, or some other component about that you would like to give us guidance about? San Mateo County, I think, is limiting number of nights, I think, to 90 a year for unhosted. Redwood City's doing 120, which is, if you think about that, that's half a year. I think that's too much.
Through summer.
Yeah, so I'll stop. I think your commission colleagues may be able to inform your question too.
Can you go back to the slide that has the statistics around usage and revenue? And I was just trying to get the number of 33 short-term rentals.
Well, that's probably more than that, but that's the one they have
Right.
data on, right?
So I have some neighbors who benefit from short-term rentals, and I have some neighbors who complain vociferously about them. So, you know, is it compatible? And where would it be compatible? To me, we have neighborhoods that are designed for people. We also have, who live here, we also have an obligation to assist with coastal access, and there's never enough housing in California. So the Coastal Commission's given us the guidance that they're generally supportive of short-term rentals. So the question is, what do we do that fits within our neighborhood or our concept of our neighborhood? What's compatible? To me, strongly agree that we should, I mean, if we're going to have a starting place, a starting foundation, hosted proof of residency, totally agree with that. Doing this in mobile homes, I don't think it makes sense. many of the people I know who do rent out these properties actually have an accessory dwelling unit that they're using for these purposes. So I don't see a big issue with that. In my view, I'm keen to hear what other people's my fellow commissioners' opinions are on that one, but I would actually keep the ADUs. But I agree with the mobile homes and the areas that are not single resident homes. Generally speaking, I'd stick with that. I would also, again, limit the number of nights per year. Absolutely, limit occupancy. Hotels have limits on occupancy. There's no reason why somebody's doing this should have not have a limit on the occupancy. I also look. We're making $80,000 a year. There's probably, I know Adam Eisen did some research on his own, and he believes there's a little bit more money to be made, but at the end of the day, it's not a lot of money for enforcement. So it's not like we have some major thing. So we also have to, as a starting point, look at what makes it easy to manage from a city perspective. So my view would be to go with the proof of residency, go with the hosted, have a business license, and have some concept like a 3 strikes rule for folks. If you're given 3 citations in a calendar year, then you lose your license for the remainder of the current calendar year and the following full calendar year. Something with teeth, because if you don't put the onus on the person who's doing this, then they're not going to be responsible. And again, what makes it compatible is, does it fit in the neighborhood? I appreciate what you're doing and trying to be thoughtful and worried about it. It's the guy next to you who's not so thoughtful that ruins it for everybody, right? So that's how I would approach it.
I'm in agreement, I think, as far as the issue that you raise, and what we don't want to see people buying homes and just renting them out. Of course, people who don't want them in their neighborhoods, they probably have a house 2 or 3 doors down that has 4 or 5 people that are in there running it anyway. So, I mean, it's I don't think you can stop it. So the question is how to control it in a way that is positive for the neighborhood and positive for Half Moon Bay. Number one, I think 90, as far as a number, that's probably as high as you ought to go. That's and if it's less than that, I wouldn't mind either. But I think more than that, in effect, that creates a problem. Second issue I have is that if you limit the number in a neighborhood, you're in effect granting somebody property rights. I don't want to see that. So I think if you limit it, say 60 days, 90 days, and anybody that wants it, I think that's, at least that's the way I would do it, because again, otherwise it's an issue. I checked off the issue on mobile homes when you raised it. I agree that's not something I'd like to see. I also like the idea of penalties, 3 strikes and you're out for a year or 2. Although I think enforcement is important. I mean, I don't think if you don't have enforcement, you're going to have all kinds of abuses. And I think as you get more money, whether you hire somebody directly or join up with San Mateo County or other areas, that I think it's important to ensure that A, you know who's renting these out, B, they have licenses, C, that any complaints are documented, and so I'd like to see fairly rigorous enforcement, at least down the road. I mean, not on day one. So I think those are the key issues that I have down. But I think the point that's being raised is we don't want to take away housing and rentals on the coast, and trying to fit that in with a viable policy is difficult. It's complex, but I think to the extent that we can write an ordinance that gives more weight to rentals and less to Airbnb, I'd like to see it in some way, shape, or form.
So, first, I'm tempted to ask for a motion to extend for 45 minutes and a couple of bottles of wine to hear Lance tell us the spicier stories.
Oh.
But I don't think I'll do that.
Make a motion to take that offline.
Joke. I kid. I also think that bringing this item to the commission right after the study session on ADUs is the mark of a seasoned and wise planning director, so that we have clarity in our thinking about the trade-offs, and I think that's evident in my colleague's point of view. With respect to the kinds of restrictions that you're thinking about, I support Les's point of view. I'll go a little further and say I think 90 is too much. I actually think 60 is probably a better number. And I think that ultimately what's important is that we manage by objective at some level here. What we're trying to do, and I think I fully support your perspective, which is to hold these short-term rentals to the standard of home businesses in terms of not creating an impact. And I think implicit in that is whether we think the goal is to maximize the ability of the property owner to profit from his investment, or whether we expect that to be balanced with not creating adverse impacts, a nuisance for their neighbors, or maximizing TOT. I'm pretty sure the city is not trying to max out TOT. We'll take it, but that's not a driving consideration. And I do believe that with respect to the question of in what areas is it appropriate, implied in that is a recognition that neighborhoods are sensitive receptors. We see that in our noise ordinance. We see that with respect to the kinds of speed limits that we allow for circulation. I don't see why short-term rentals represent another kind of sharing of the space amongst the community that needs to be respected and managed and balanced. So I think your thinking about this in terms of the home office is right on the money. With respect to what the thresholds should be, in the home ordinance, if a neighbor complains that there are too many cars, or there's a high incidence of disturbance, that complaint goes to the I think it goes to the city the first time. There is no 3 strikes, and the planning commission gets to make a decision. The idea is that the hammer is heavy enough that nobody messes with, they value their business license enough that they don't create that kind of adverse impact. In my years on the planning commission in the 90s, I saw exactly one case of a business license that came to the planning commission for a failure to conform to those ordinances. So if the teeth are big enough, the exception will prove the rule. I don't know, if you want multiple strikes, that's fine, but remember the due process of a confirmed violation is a lot more overhead than the issuance of a citation. So if you want to quantify what the impact is, be sure to clarify where you're thinking about it.
I just want to respond to that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
3 strikes is illustrative. It's my point is simply there's a reason why we've only seen amongst us probably one situation where somebody's come to the planning commission for a violation. It's onerous, it's painful for the person who's filing the complaint. The objective is something that's easy to administrate, that's clear cut. It's not ambiguous. If you're given a citation by, noise ordinance, right? San Mateo County Sheriff could cite you, right?
It's really hard to get a citation for noise violations. but you're right. I follow, yeah, I follow you.
Trying to come up, the concept was, it was for illustrative purposes.
And I'm not disagreeing with you. I just wanted, you know, as you're crafting an ordinance, to think about what the standard is. You know, create a hammer that's big enough that it has incentive that you don't have to go through the process. That's what I'm kind of hoping.
Yeah, we don't want to spend overtime for everybody coming to a planning commission meeting.
And then with respect to hosted, unhosted, you know, there is a neighbor that I'm aware of in a neighborhood that's not too far from me who does have unhosted rentals. And I will tell you that in my experience, some of them come off without a hitch, and you know, the neighbors don't even know that it's there. And in other cases, we've had neighbors that built fences because they were so upset. They wanted to go up, and it created a very difficult circumstance for those neighbors. And these are all good people. And the difference was that it was unhosted. You know, if the circumstances involved a party in the backyard that ran till quite late, and it was an example of what was inconsistent with the residential use of the area. It felt more like they sort of, the consumers of that rental, their thinking seemed to be modeled on the hot tub at the Holiday Inn, you know, when you were in college, which for some of us was a lot longer than others. I don't know what it's like, but I would just add one other angle on that, which is that whether it's hosted or unhosted, there always needs to be, you know, if we decide to permit unhosted, there should be someone next door that neighbors can go to. Maybe that's a backdoor host, I don't know. But there should be somebody who is a responsible in the neighborhood who's willing to take that. And if they have to get paid by the landowner, I'm okay with that. You know, but there's got to be a place where the citizens who don't attend these meetings, who don't know what the rules are, know that they can go to say, hey, how come it's 12 o'clock and the lights are on over there and I can't use my backyard because they're partying? The last comment I have is with respect to safety. I think that I believe that no smoking should be a condition of our Airbnbs or our sorry, I don't want to brand it, short-term rentals. All of the above. The goal here is not to prevent people from enjoying their smokes. The goal is to avoid a fire. You know, it's not to say that I don't want our citizens to exercise their established right to enjoy marijuana or cigarettes. No one is arguing that cigarettes are illegal. But I think that no smoking rules in public places has been established. I don't know the extent to which the city can extend that into rentals. But I do worry about someone who doesn't own the property, who doesn't realize how flammable the lands are adjacent to these properties, might just decide it's time to have, you know, a small fire or fireworks. It's 4th of July, let's rent the place and shoot up some bottle rockets, you know, or, you know, being stoned enough that they inadvertently start something. I understand that there's a need to balance these, but I do, you know, so far in the ordinance discussion, I haven't heard the public safety aspect. I've heard the nuisance aspect, and I want to bring the safety in. Otherwise, I support the wisdom of my fellow commissioners. Thank you.
So to give actual feedback and comment, not just questions, it seems like properties west of Highway 1 and in the kind of commercial core are going to be the most desirable areas for these Airbnbs. We only have one public elementary school. Maybe we should be considering some distance around that elementary school that's maybe not appropriate for an Airbnb. And is it possible to do a pilot program rather than a permanent ordinance? Is there any advantage to something like that, where we kind of try some things out, and then if it's working out, or
Let us look into it. Okay.
might be then we could.
Yep.
Oops, we didn't get that one right. Let's adjust it next year. Something like that.
One thing that I've seen some other cities do is to have a requirement that after a certain number of units are registered or permitted, that it comes back to the city for further study. So just to sort of have a trigger in place to make sure that the city is looking at it in the future.
I like that. I think that's a really good way to approach it. Again, thank you for organizing this the way that you have, putting these agenda items all together. I think it was it's a great way to think through these things and get your mind around stuff. So the only other comment I would add is any single, going back to the business license concept, any situation where you don't pay your TOT should count as a strike in my world, or just something like if you have instances where you can point to, hey, you've clearly rented this out 3 times, I can see the comments on the website, then you're not paying your taxes. I just think that's yeah, the 90 days, maybe so. I was thinking probably not very thoughtfully longer, but you know, if the guys here think 60 to 90 days is more appropriate for a neighborhood in terms of the number of nights.
Wouldn't it kind of depend on the neighborhood?
I think it's, you
Like
can't.
if it's downtown, if it's Main Street, who cares if it's every day?
Well, you know, I mean,
Some neighborhoods would be more.
it's a rental issue. I mean, are you gonna have homes for people to rent, or are they gonna do B&Bs? And I think if you limit the B&Bs, they're more likely to rent them because there's probably more revenue if you can rent a place for a year than do 60 or 90 days for a B&B.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I think that to me, it's less dependent on what the neighborhood is, and that's an indirect way of saying it depends on what the impact is. That downtown, your vision is that it's a little bit more active at night, and I'm going to put words in your mouth, so please correct me if I'm off. But I'm hoping that that's, you know, if you're thinking that way, the nice thing about the way they're thinking about the business license ordinance is that it's all about avoiding impacts. And you know, if somebody did a Airbnb, you know, a short-term rental, and it was like no impacts, literally no impacts, you know, and it's not taking away a affordable housing, I'm okay with it being there a lot. But, you know, pursuant to John's comment, I like the idea of getting some data and having some experience, not just with the program as a whole, but with that unit. If somebody wants to do more than 60, I'd like to find out about the experience they've had before they go up from there. You know, I'm being risk averse because it's a lot easier to grant escalating rights than to try to take them back once you've licensed them.
No, I think that's reasonable. I think in going back to the report, I think you kind of indicate, well, what do you do about the different zoning areas, and maybe you consider the point, right? And downtown is zoned differently, and maybe you can treat it in a different way. So yeah, I don't think we necessarily need to have a uniform policy, but maybe sticking with the existing zoning and, to Jimmy's point, impacts on the neighborhood. The smoking thing, I think this kind of goes back to hosted versus unhosted. You have a lot less irresponsible behavior when something's hosted. So I just strongly would be inclined towards, just for the time being, going to hosted, because that addresses the safety. I think we don't have a smoking ordinance for the city and for private spaces.
So if the host lived in the ADU, then they're able to kind of track what's going on, and that's sufficiently hosted. Hosted doesn't have to be in the building during the party.
Hosted is on the property.
Hosted is on the property, okay. Yeah, trying to figure out what hosting means.
Do we have any idea of the 33, how many are hosted and how many are not?
No, I don't. And if we, you know, we'll come back to you. with
No, I
the
mean,
draft.
I rent places up at Lake Tahoe that are unhosted and so on, and other places too. I mean, my druthers would be both hosted and unhosted, but again, be conservative in terms of the ordinance, limit it, and again, either a year from now or if 500 people get licenses, let's come back. But that would be my druthers if I saw the ordinance coming back. But I think we'll all get another bite of the apple once we see what you put together, right?
You will. Can Steph ask? Can we have a turn to ask clarifying questions?
No, you can't.
Please.
Yes, please.
All right. So, what I think I heard you say is there seems to be a lean towards hosted, and I'm not sure if that was only in the single-family neighborhoods, but also in the mixed-use areas. We also heard about limiting the number of nights per year, and most jurisdictions that have done that limit them on unhosted rentals. You could limit for either one, but we are just curious. There's even jurisdictions that allow unlimited hosted and then have a limit on having a few unhosted nights per year. So there's all kinds of combinations. I hope we don't get super picky about it in maybe the first 6 to 12 months. We like the trigger of, if we know about 33 of these and if we get to 50, that might be a reasonable, you would like a higher trigger.
I think you're going to need to probably get to like 100. I think you probably
100?
have 100 now.
That may be, well, you have a good point. We recognize that we don't know where all of them are. Yes, we understand. Okay, so anyway, if we had a little more of a sense of the limits of nights and hosted and unhosted where, single family versus mixed use, I think we could come up with that is the foundation of the land use part of the ordinance.
So
That's
again,
a big deal.
I'm for the single family limit, again, because of the housing shortage and so on. But the question is, how do you monitor that? I mean, for example, places behind Stone Pine, what's the name of the units up there? The condos. Is that considered single family or not?
So we would consider that to be single family attached and not rental, it's ownership. And so for what we were coming in with, that they would be qualifying to have a short-term rental.
Okay, so, I mean, is there a pretty clear definition what's multifamily and what's not?
We were citing multifamily rental, and so we're looking at duplexes, triplexes, and apartments, and not ownership condominiums or townhomes that would have a subdivision map resulting in a parcel per unit.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, trying to simplify this. So it seems like whether or not it's a hosted or unhosted is a pretty weak way to try to control this. I mean, it's really the screening of the tenant, and some landlords do great jobs and some do terrible jobs. And whether or not they're on the property or not doesn't make much difference. So it seems like we still need this test drive of allowing some unhosted units in residential neighborhoods to see if it can work. Because I can see real business limitations to folks that want to Airbnb their own home, and they don't want to be there when someone else is there, so it's, that's just my, on that part.
No, I think that, Jill raised the interesting point. I mean, I rent properties in Tahoe and other places, right? So I do the unhosted thing. I dare say we haven't gotten any complaints, but I don't know. But so maybe just having a more conservative approach if we do unhosted, like 30-day or 60-day limits as we try this out. We're not saying no, we're just saying, hey, let's figure out what we're doing before we get ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Jill and John, because I do think that there's a space in this world for unhosted. I think the challenge is how we mitigate the impacts. And you could pick a responsible tenant who lets the party get out of hand, and there's nobody to go to. The question is, what do we need to do to be sure that the adjacent neighbors don't get burned down or annoyed? Maybe I should have said annoyed or burned down. And equally, what do we do to make sure that someone doesn't come back to the city and said, because you allowed this use and it has harmed me, that person ran over my kid, you are liable. How do we, I want to be sure we're protecting the city, and that so maybe there's a requirement for adequate insurance. Maybe there's a restriction with respect to controlling liability here. A responsibility to restore the condition of the property. And that rests with the owner. They can subrogate and hold the tenant responsible, but that might provide the kind of incentives that we need to make sure that the owner is a bit more careful about screening. The goal here is not to kill the rentals. The goal here is to kill the impacts. Yeah, I want no more impacts than I would from a residence. That's what I expect in a residential short-term rental. That's the standard in my book.
So
30 days maybe? Didn't see how it goes?
a nice thing about our community is it's kind of geographically isolated and relatively small. And since we don't right now have any mechanism to know where these short-term rentals are, when we do know where they are, the police are also going to know where they are. And so we do have a mechanism just within our own sort of self-policing here, that our own community, to kind of watch out for each other here.
You know. So, yeah, it's just to say I know neighbors who have been confronted with letters warning that they have not paid their TOT when in fact they have never had any rentals. And it's an honest mistake and it gets worked out. But the policing mechanisms they're imperfect. And that's why your point about getting
I'm thinking if somebody's got a party going, the neighbor calls the police. Or the police know, excuse me, our local community knows where these like they know where the hotels are. They're going to keep an eye on things, evenings and weekends and stuff like that. So it's us taking care of ourselves. It's not some sort of regulation.
Yeah. Well, we can talk more about that because you're right, it's getting late.
Jill, did you have any other questions you want to clarify?
I
At least
wanted
one more.
Okay, I wanted to give, I think we're good. I wanted to give Sarah the chance to just click through the kinds of controls that would come into any ordinance that you would see.
Certainly. So in this round, we really tried to focus on the land use issues, but so you know what to expect when you see an ordinance coming your way. There are a number of sort of standard controls in place to address some of these issues that you were just raising. Proof of insurance is definitely one that is commonly required. We've also drafted indemnity provisions where the short-term rental owner indemnifies the city for any disasters that were to happen. There's also a number of things related to sort of public and renter information campaigns that cities have built into their ordinances. So requiring certain things in the rental contracts, requiring certain things to be posted in any advertisements about the short-term rentals, those sort of making sure folks know what the parking requirements, what the garbage limits are, noise limits, that sort of thing. We talked about the on-site manager or local contact person, and then certainly the variety of enforcement and penalty and revocation of registration that we've talked about. All of those are things that we will be bringing back to you when we have a draft ordinance, but I wanted to assure you that there are things that we're thinking about and will be included.
Are there other conduits, like the Chamber of Commerce? You know, do they run a rental website, and are we hooked in to get information that way as well as Airbnb and so forth? Great, thank you.
Lovely, thank you. With that, I'm going to close this. We have, do you have any other items that you would like to cover? And if not, barring any communications from my fellow commissioners, not seeing any, can I get a motion? Oh, he's got one.
So just to let my fellow commissioners know, there have been at least 2 listening sessions with the city council. There's one coming up, I think, Thursday or something like that. And the comments are on the city website. And I think there are issues for the planning commission that might be helpful down the road. So I urge everybody to get on the website, look at those, or Thursday if you're around. Where's the one on Thursday?
5 p.m. to 7 p.m. at Kenyatta Cove Community Room.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
That's great. I spent an hour and a half at water polo practice listening to neighbors recount their listening session, and they loved it. So really positive feedback. People are really excited about it.
I also have heard that and would like to attend one, but I want to be sure that we don't inadvertently create a quorum. Is anybody on the commission here tonight planning to go to the Thursday night session?
I am not.
I was on Saturday.
It's, as long as we don't all comment, it's not a quorum, right?
I want to avoid the appearance of I want 2 or fewer if I can do it. Sounds like,
I probably won't be there Thursday.
okay, I call dibs on Thursday.
Thank you, Les. Well, with that, I'd like to get a motion. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.